We're live streaming. Okay. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to council meeting number 36 on Wednesday, September 4th, 2022. Certainly before we call the meeting to order, just a couple of notes. First of all, I want to thank the nearly 700 volunteers who came out on Sunday in preparation for the international plowing match. We had an overwhelming response, and Councillor Doreen O'Sullivan and her colleague Kathy Shepherd have ably co-chaired the volunteer recruitment committee. So obviously, Councillor O'Sullivan, good success and fantastic enthusiasm on Sunday. I don't know, Councillor O'Sullivan, if there's another opportunity to sign up. Are we maxed out for volunteers? We're good now? Over 1,000, is that the case? Over 1,000 registered. So if you don't know about the international plowing match, it is certainly worth applauding. I think we're a community that is renowned for its volunteerism, its enthusiasm, its passion to see good things happen here, and it really is on the strength of so many volunteers. This event is incredibly multifaceted with over 40 subcommittees. Doreen, is that about it?
I think it's closer to 52,
yes.
I think.
Okay.
Yeah, quite a few.
52 subcommittees, so obviously the reliance on the goodwill of the host community and many of the volunteers have stepped up is quite high, and we're obviously very thrilled as a council to welcome the IPM to North Granville. Remarkably, despite the fact that we had Campbell College here for 100 years, we'd never had that opportunity to host the IPM, so to be able to do it on 626 acres of Campbell campus lands, now owned by the municipality in partnership with the Bennett Farm, is really wonderful. Doreen, is there anything else I should be saying about IPM?
Just that the volunteer portal is closed now because we have reached over 1,000. But if we do need more, we will certainly take more. So that anyone who does register will be staying in the waiting room, if you may, and then if we need more volunteers, we'll bring them into the fold. So, but it's amazing. The energy and enthusiasm is awesome. So thanks to everyone who has already volunteered, or even people who are just going to come and enjoy the event.
We would ask that you appeal to the universe or the gods or whomever you wish for great weather. So that's the last piece. Yes.
So you must be already a registered volunteer. Yeah, good. Well, thank you. Yeah, so if you're already registered, then you're on that list. When we need help for anything, like we need 20 a day from now until it's all cleaned up out at Tented City. So for about 2 weeks after it's over, because everything that you see out there on that 58 acres has to be taken apart. So it won't end on the 24th. But anyway, thank you for signing up, and any help we need, we will be sending out an email. Okay.
So just to clarify, Doreen, it sounds like if you have registered and you're part of that portal, yeah. You may be invited or strongly encouraged to perhaps take on a different volunteer task if there's a shortage in one area. Yeah. Is that it? Tented City being particularly urgent, I think, is... Right now. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so we can't take new ones, so.
Yeah.
And you have to be registered through Volgistics to be covered by the OPA, or the Ontario Plowmen's Association insurance. So volunteers have to be registered on Volgistics.
And I believe the cap is 1,000, which is why you're not taking any more.
Well,
right
that was the cap. That's the cap for the Volgistics platform that we bought. So that they let us buy. So we're... more people can stay in the waiting room, and when people say, I'm sorry, I'm not available anymore, or take me off the list, and we remove people, then we can admit more volunteers. So, okay, thank you very much. And one final point is that the match actually opens on Tuesday,
September 20th.
The 20th. and runs till the 24th. The opening ceremonies and the parade have been switched to Wednesday, so that's a switch in the schedule. And even though the match itself starts on the 20th, on the 18th in the entertainment tent in the RV park, there is a ecumenical worship service, and anyone who is interested is more than welcome to attend that. It's at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, yes, open to absolutely anyone who wants to come.
Good. Okay. Certainly on, not just because of the IPM, but nonetheless, North Granville did, I think, or I think the entire country declared this as the Year of the Garden. We did that some time ago at the invitation, I think, of the Kemptville Horticultural Society. And we certainly want to take this opportunity to thank all of the volunteers, once again, who have gone above and beyond in their efforts to beautify our community, particularly significant this year because we are hosts to potentially up to 80,000 people. So in particular, we received or we're highly encouraged to commend the work of two volunteers, Greg and Lorraine Barrow. They take care of Rotary Park on behalf of the Kemptville Horticultural Society in cooperation with municipal staff. And I can't tell you how many compliments and emails and messages I think so many of us have received to thank certainly staff, but also Greg and Lorraine in particular, who have worked very, very hard on beautification. To that end, they have also given their valuable time and enhanced the gardens at the post office, Equinel, and the Giving Garden, in addition to their own very large and amazing garden. So thank you very much, Greg and Lorraine. I don't think you're watching, but we'll make sure that you understand that we very, very much appreciate your commitment. I think Greg and Lorraine are relatively new residents, if I'm not mistaken, and just really seized it upon themselves to look after some areas that municipal staff couldn't always get to, and they've really made their mark, and what a year to do it, particularly when it came to the post office, where it wasn't always possible, or even Canada Post wasn't maintaining a little parkette there. So to have Greg and Lorraine step up as they have is, I think, really emblematic of what North Granville is, and whether you've been here for 5 generations or just a few years. Finally, if you're looking for the schedule for the IPM, some people have been asking. It is now available on the Facebook page for IPM 2022. You can also go to explorenorthgranville.ca, and we've also tried to feature the information in a really easy way, so that if you have any confusion or you don't know which day you can attend, if you only have one to choose, lots of information on IPM's webpage, or certainly explorenorthgranville.ca. Good. So with that, I will call the meeting to order, and I am going to ask council, I'm just moving my computer so I can see, I will invite a member of council to read our land acknowledgement. I believe, Councillor Wilson, you've decided to do it this evening, is that right?
The municipality of North Granville acknowledges that the municipality operates on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe. We honor the historic relationship of the Haudenosaunee and Huron-Wendat peoples to this land. We recognize all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who now call North Granville their home. We respect and support the need for cultivating a strong relationship with all Indigenous peoples, and we look forward to continuing this conversation and fostering the path towards reconciliation.
Thank you. So moving on, colleagues, you see before you an agenda this evening. It has been amended so that we can deal with the proposed federal electoral districts redistribution. Every municipality in Ontario certainly has been invited to respond to a redrawing of boundaries every municipality in Canada, I'm sure, has been invited, but germane to Ontario and our municipality, we did add that so we could have a brief discussion about how to provide some feedback on what is a very tight timeline. So with that, I'll look for a mover and a seconder, please, for the adoption of the agenda this evening. Councillor Strachan, Councillor Barkley, and I would like to say happy birthday, Councillor Barkley. Appreciate you being here on your birthday. And I'll call the question. All in favor? Good. So we have an agenda. So we will go straight to a delegation. Unfortunately, neither of the representatives who submitted the request for the proclamation of Franco-Ontario Day are with us this evening, but we have recognized them in the past. They have come and made presentations, and for several years now, on September 25th, since 2010, in fact, Franco-Ontarian Day has been recognized across the province. This day obviously marks the contributions of Ontario's diverse and growing francophone community. L'école élémentaire et secondaire publique Rivière-Rideau et l'Académie catholique Notre-Dame requests that Council declare September 25th, 2022 as Franco-Ontarian Day in North Grenville and fly the Franco-Ontarian Day flag on September 25th and 26th. What we do know is that we've done this for several years here in North Grenville, and that we understand from census data that the municipality has more than 1,000 Francophones representing the Francophone community here in North Grenville. So considering our population, that is notable. So I am going to invite my council colleague, Councillor Strachan, to make similar remarks in French.
Nous serions honorés si Madame la mairesse et les conseillères et conseillers municipaux pouvaient se joindre à nous pour cette belle célébration. Des représentants et des élèves de l'école élémentaire et secondaire publique Rivière-Rideau ainsi que de l'Académie catholique Notre-Dame assisteront à cet événement. Merci de votre appui et de votre collaboration. Angela Sartosini, directrice de l'Académie catholique Notre-Dame, et Hugo Castonguay, directeur de l'école élémentaire et secondaire Rivière-Rideau.
Thank you. So with that in mind, council colleagues, of course we are very well aware that we have both the French public and French Catholic schools functioning and growing on Kemptville campus as well. So it was the principals of both those schools that made this submission. So I'll look for any questions before asking for a mover and a seconder for the recommendation. Questions, concerns? No? Okay. So Councillor Wilson, were you trying to move the recommendation? Okay, excellent. And a seconder, thank you, Councillor Sullivan. And that is that Council receive the very brief presentation that we've just made and proclaim September 25th, 2022 as Franco-Ontarian Day and direct the Franco-Ontarian flag to be raised September 25th and 26th. We have a mover and a seconder. Seeing no questions, comments, I'll call the question. All in favor? Good. Thank you. So we'll next move to the consent agenda. There are a number of items, colleagues, under the consent agenda. And I would ask whether anyone has an objection for the items below, which are largely administrative, save and except for maybe planning and development, a signed bylaw amendment. Any appetite to remove an item? Councillor Sullivan?
Could we remove item number 5, please? The sign bylaw amendment, please? Just so there's more discussion and information shared. Okay. Thank you.
Good. So with that in mind, we'll ask for a mover and seconder for the consent agenda as amended. Councillor Barkley? Councillor Strachan, thank you. And Amy, we'll go to you. Remind me for the signed bylaw amendment. Thank you. I'll call the vote. All in favor? Good. Okay. Minutes of previous meeting. Did we just do that? Clerk, thank you. So then we'll move to reports. And from the Office of the CEO, we have Ms. Janou here this evening. She's going to do a very brief presentation on what has been presented to certainly communities in our riding in regards to a name change and redrawn boundaries for what is now being proposed as Gananoque, Brockville, Grenville, or Prescott, but we have some suggestions about the name, if not the boundaries. Go ahead, Hillary.
Okay, thank you and good evening, Council. So as the Mayor said, I'll be presenting the newly proposed federal electoral districts. Next slide, please. Federal electoral districts are reviewed after the census every 10 years to reflect changes in movements in Canada's population. The new federal electoral boundaries will take effect during a general election held after April 2024. The Commission is holding public hearings in person and virtually to gather comments and feedback on the proposed boundaries and electoral district names. These hearings are taking place up until the end of October, and feedback can also be submitted by mail or email as well. The current district is named Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes. The proposed district is named Gananoque, Brockville, Prescott. Next slide, please. So this map shows the current district, which most people would know as the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville, also containing the city of Brockville and the towns of Gananoque and Prescott. Next slide, please. And the proposed district consists of the city of Brockville, the northern part of Kingston, the towns of Gananoque and Prescott, the municipality of North Grenville, the townships of Athens, Augusta, Edwardsburg Cardinal, Front of Young, and Leeds and Thousand Islands, as well as the southern part of the township of Elizabethtown Kitley and the southern part of the township of South Frontenac. Next slide, please. As the Mayor mentioned, staff are recommending the proposed district be named Gananoque, Brockville, and Grenville to better reflect the composition of the region, and are seeking direction from Council to submit this feedback to the Commission. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So we did have a discussion at the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville, where I sit, in regards to the redrawn boundaries. Some concern is being expressed by neighboring municipalities that feel impacted, where an example being Elizabethtown Kitley, the entire municipality, certainly up to now, has been part of the riding, and now their municipality would be split in two. So there's some concern about how the lines would be drawn moving in the future, and I, out of support from my county colleagues and neighboring municipalities, endorsed a motion at County Council to seek further clarity and dialogue on the boundaries themselves, where I, however, become particularly concerned on behalf of North Grenville is that the proposed riding name has been Gananoque, Brockville, Prescott. It practically eviscerates the entire Grenville County, even though we all remain part of the federal riding. I think it's myopic, and I indicated to staff that I felt it was important to actually say that this riding should be called Gananoque, Brockville, Grenville. It is far more inclusive of the 4 municipalities that are part of Grenville County. And the riding doesn't stop in Prescott, and I don't know why they would choose a smaller urban municipality as the name, much to the south of us, when the riding goes basically all the way to our border with Ottawa. So to that end, Council, I am seeking your support to submit renaming of the riding, irregardless of whether or not the boundaries change to the south. Grenville County will not change at this stage. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that our riding has a name that's inclusive of the entire region, and that is why I believe that the name Prescott should be replaced with Grenville. Any questions or concerns? Councillor Barclay?
I'd be in support of what you're proposing, and I wonder if the clerk or Ms. Chenot can put up that last slide, which I think really illustrates your point. And can we get that up on the screen as well? There. So you'll see the border takes a jog to include North Grenville. So certainly Grenville County is a fairly significant part of the new riding, and I'd be in support of that name change. Thanks.
Any other comments or concerns? Certainly, I feel it's a bit of a sensitive issue for me, because I think, as we know, often in North Grenville, if not in Grenville, we often feel that we're not well reflected or well served sometimes. So again, I think this is an effort to make sure that North Grenville and the municipalities within Grenville County are well represented and not invisibilized, if you will. So Councillor Barclay, would you like to move that, since you spoke to it? A seconder, please. Councillor Strachian. Any further discussion? Okay, I'll call the vote. All in favor? Of course, just because we make that submission does not mean it will happen, but I think it is important that we intervene as quickly as possible. Thank you for your support. Going to finance, nothing. Over to the office of the clerk, and I understand there's a recommendation. No, we've dealt with it. It's enclosed. Okay, thank you. So that's a closed matter that will follow our open meeting. So now we are going to planning and development. Am I correct about that? And we are convening our public meeting for the zoning bylaw. Is that right? Amendment that is proposed. And to that end, thank you very much, Ms. Workman. I'll read the script that I am legally bound to read. It might sound boring, but I have no choice. This is what the province asks that one reads at the beginning of any public meeting that is convened for a matter under the Planning Act. So council will now hold a public meeting to consider an application to amend the zoning on the lands located at 810 Victoria Avenue, part of Joseph Adams Block of Registered Plan 11, Geographic Town of Kemptville, now the Municipality of North Grenville, to rezone the property from residential first density to residential second density. I must advise that this meeting is your opportunity to voice any objections or concerns you have with the proposed amendment. If an appellant does not provide oral comments or written submissions before council adopts the proposed amendment, the local planning appeal tribunal may refuse to consider objections. Any person who wishes further notice of the council's decision should leave coordinates with the Director of Planning, who is here this evening, or via email following adjournment. Anyone wishing to ask a question during the meeting can do so by coming to the mic. And when asking a question, we do name your name and address as part of the public record. We know there are many people here for this public meeting. If you could just raise your hands so we know how many are here. Okay, good number. All right, so I'll pass the meeting over to Director of Planning and Development, Amy Martin, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Your Worship. Our Deputy Director, Mr. Mosher, will be taking this file.
Welcome, Mr. Mosher.
Thanks, Ms. Martin and Your Worship. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this shows the subject property in a little bit of close-in context on Victoria Avenue. You can see that Joseph Street is to the west, and Jack Street is over to the east. Next slide, please. This shows just a little bit better the aerial photograph of the area. The lot in question is 100 feet of frontage by 148 feet of depth. Can be characterized as in a mostly established part of town as an underutilized lot, being that the dwelling's located on one half. Next slide, please. The official plan designates this property as residential. We can go right to the next slide, please. And the proposed development would be for a new semi-detached dwelling to be constructed on that eastern underutilized part. And it would also recognize some lot compliance deficiencies through an amending zoning bylaw. Presently, the lands are zoned residential first density, and the proposal is that they would become residential second density, specific to the concept plan. And again, those lands are designated residential. Next slide, please. So this is the concept plan that had been submitted with the application to the department. It's important to note that these lands are the subject of a concurrent application for consent under the Planning Act, and that's application B4322. So our office has not yet provided formal comments on that application. Wanted to have this meeting first, but you can see that the results of the development would be existing dwelling remains on the west side of the property, and then a proposed new semi-detached dwelling would be constructed on the east with a driveway which goes through a central carriageway to the rear where there would be parking and garage structures presently proposed. Next slide, please. Any application that's submitted has to be reviewed by staff through several policy lenses, the first of them being the Provincial Policy Statement, or the PPS. And among other things, the PPS directs that healthy and livable communities are supported by efficient development and land use patterns, which sustain the financial well-being of municipalities over the long term. Development needs to accommodate an appropriate and affordable market-based range of uses, densities, and houses. It has to avoid development land use patterns which might lead to environmental, public health, and safety concerns, and it needs to ensure that there's necessary infrastructure to support development. Vitality and regeneration of settlement areas is promoted through the PPS, and settlement areas, which Kemptville is one, is where this type of development and growth is to be directed. Next slide, please. So a lot to say about intensification within the provincial policy statement themselves. They are intensification is a form of development which is promoted, especially when it can maintain compact form. It also has to avoid risks to public health and safety. Planning authorities, of which North Grenville is one, have to provide for an appropriate range and mix of housing options and densities, and ensure that as we plan for growth, infrastructure and public service facilities are available while planning for a changing climate. Next slide, please. So going down the policy hierarchy, underneath the provincial policy statement is the county's official plan. It recognizes that these lands are settlement area and notes that they are to be the focus of growth. And this helps to preserve areas surrounding the municipality to remain in agricultural or other types of uses more appropriate for those locations. Within the settlement areas, again, similar to the PPS, intensification, infill, redevelopment of vacant or underutilized sites is promoted. And it's recognized that this is because there's limited opportunities for intensification to make good use of those services. So it is promoted wherever feasible and appropriate. Next slide, please. Again, North Grenville's official plan designates the lands as residential. The goal is to promote a mix of housing types that will satisfy North Grenville's needs. So the range of dwelling types, infill, intensification, and promoting development that makes efficient use of land are identified as objectives. Importantly for this application, there is a maximum density cap of 45 units per hectare, which is the limit within the official plan. This proposed development does not exceed that limit through the intensification application submitted. Intensification does need to be supported in certain instances by a neighborhood compatibility and character statement report, demonstrating how the proposal will meet the existing character of the neighborhood. Next slide, please. In support of the application, a planning rationale, a supplementary planning rationale, and a neighborhood character statement and compatibility report, in addition to the concept plan, were submitted by the applicant. These drawings, in summary, went through similar policy analysis and review that I've just covered here. And in terms of the character and image, the compatibility report, it noted that it's an eclectic mix of different types of dwellings with a range of styles. The common theme for character and image was that most are mainly 2 stories. The site design notes that within the property itself, existing driveways would be maintained. There's 2 at the site presently, and those would also be coming forward into the future intensification. And in terms of servicing, it notes that services do exist or could be extended to the property as needed, and concludes that the current neighborhood does not follow an established architectural pattern, and that the site design, building design, and materials proposed would be compatible. Next slide, please. So at the time that this slide deck was prepared, we had only received a letter of no objection from the Health Unit as well as the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority. But subsequent to that, we've received quite a lot of letters of concern and objection and comments. So I'll just read them and I'll summarize the issues as best I can. So a letter of objection was received from Ms. Breedick, from Mr. Carmichael, from Mr. Murray, from Ms. Lavitt, and from Mr. Cromwell. And a summary of the issues identified was that there would be a change of the historic nature of the neighborhood. There was concerns with the additional traffic as well as parking issues that may arise from the intensification. There was concerns with servicing impacts and a concern that intensification was occurring outside of the official plan and or zoning. I'll just speak briefly to some of those. I can confirm that as far as policy review goes, the intensification is being proposed, in the opinion of myself and staff, that the intensification is proposed consistent with North Grenville's official plan. I think the developer and his agent is here as well, and they may be able to answer some of the other questions regarding the historic nature and potentially traffic or parking concerns, but staff's reviewed the neighborhood compatibility and character statement report and can also concur with the findings of it. So that concludes my report, but as again, the agent and the developer are here, so I'm sure they will answer questions.
Okay, colleagues, and for people in the audience seats, you're not an audience, you're participants, but for anyone in the room, I'll look to council colleagues for any questions on Mr. Mosher's report. Then we do have an opportunity to hear from the applicant and or his representative, and then we will invite members who are here to express concerns or otherwise to take the floor. So that's the order of events. So council colleagues, anything for Mr. Mosher at this time? If not, we'll move to hearing from the applicant. Okay, so is the applicant prepared to speak? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. My name is Chris Clark. I work for Xander Plan in Perth. We're the agents on the application. So I reviewed all of the comments that were received. I think there are some issues raised in terms of older neighborhood and sort of the design of the building that's been sort of addressed through the character statement and by Mr. Mosher already. In terms of parking and traffic congestion, the driveway will lead to parking in the rear yard. All the cars will be directed sort of to the back of the property. The proposed garage provides 4 parking spaces on site. It's not anticipated any on-street parking is going to be required. There was some concerns with kids, walking and people walking in the neighborhood and what impact that might have. I think whoever lives here is going to be committed to ensuring that they're not driving irresponsibly as they're coming out of this site. I realize that they're going to be coming down this driveway into the street through a carriageway that might make it a little more difficult to see. I think it'll be the onus of whoever lives here that they're careful with how they're operating their vehicles. I don't think that, they're going to be speeding down the driveway and into the roadway. In terms of, construction noise, tree removal, all that kind of stuff, that's typical for construction and new development. That can't really be avoided. I don't know of any mature trees necessarily that need to be removed, maybe along the front of the property, but other than that, I think those concerns could be mitigated by just, not doing construction late at night and things like that. In terms of drainage and impervious area, there's still quite a bit of open space at the back of the site. It's not all going to be pavement or patio or anything like that. And then preservation of the old town. I understand it's an older neighborhood, but eventually things do need to be updated and replaced. And there is a couple instances of newer builds in this area. I think it's compatible with what's being proposed. The facade and the materials were changed a little bit to try and be a little more compatible with the neighborhood. But ultimately, I don't think it's going to stand out as something that is an eyesore in this neighborhood. If there's any other concerns that get raised, I'd be more than happy to address them.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues, any questions for the applicant in particular at this stage? Can I just have one, but I think it would be more for Ms. Martin or Mr. Mosher. What's the frequency with which we see this sort of residential intensification? Of course, I'm very well aware we have the Drac Street community living project around the corner, obviously we can see some residential intensification, particularly in Old Town where I happen to live. So I'm just curious to know what you're seeing in terms of this particular kind of intensification across the municipality.
Thank you, Your Worship, for the question. We're starting to see on an annual basis about 1 or 2 applications, but creeping up a little more annually where we do have developers that are coming in who are finding some of these underutilized lots within our existing urban fabric and proceeding with a severance application to construct semi-detached with the additional residential units in the basement. So they are intensifying the uses on that property that had previously existed before. It's not something that is uncommon, and it's going to be the trend more as we start to see more of our land within the urban area being, all our greenfield lots becoming fewer and fewer. We do look for those opportunities to intensify. So we've seen in my tenure in the last 3.5 years, on average, between 2 to 4 applications come forward within the urban area.
And then my other question is, we often cite the province, right, in these instances. I know that, of course, we've put a lot of time and effort in trying to create the conditions for affordable housing throughout North Grenville, but parking affordable, those considerations. When the province says they want residential intensification, what are they looking for?
Thank you, Your Worship. So from a policy perspective, they provide the direction where municipalities are to have policies speaking towards what intensification and infill looks like. So they set the over-hierarching idea that, urban areas, that's where we want to see growth, and we're going to encourage that residential intensification, and that's going to look different across every community. So intensification in a very large urban center could certainly mean, taking a lot and putting like a 10 to 12 story apartment building. And in smaller communities, it means, the slight upzoning of a property from, a single detached dwelling, so an R1 zone, to an R2 or an R3 zone where you could put semi-detached or townhouse units. So it's going to depend on the scale and the context of your community as to kind of what that means from a provincial policy level. But certainly in North Grenville, that trend towards intensifying to semi-detached or towns on some of these underutilized lots has become more common over the past few years, especially as, again, we start to run out of those more greenfield spots that we can utilize.
Okay. Any other questions? So Councillor Sullivan and then Councillor Barclay, and do I see Councillor Strachan? Did I see that? No. Okay. Go ahead, Councillor Sullivan.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see on the site map, the overhead one, that section 6 beside it seems to be a single home on a single lot, but it's about a quarter of the size of the lot 8 to 10 right there. So if this new building goes to the east of the existing single, it seems like it's quite a large piece of land that would accommodate the semi-detached with the 2 garages at the back and not overfill the lot space. So the allowed coverage would be within what is allowed for there would not be a variance required?
Through your worship, I will just pull up that statistic.
Sure.
And yes, so the lot coverage for the property, 35 is the permitted max for a residential second density zone. With the proposal, it would be at 34.8%, so it would not exceed it.
Yeah, so 35% of or less than 35% of all the land.
Yeah, of the new lot that's to be created.
So there'd still be 65% uncovered, okay? And then my other question is that large vacant piece of land behind, that access off of Joseph Street, that is already proposed development, I believe, for single homes? Is that?
Joseph James?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, between 311 and 315 on Joseph Street, that big.
Yeah.
There's single homes proposed in there at this point?
If I may respond, Your Worship.
Yes.
There was a plan of subdivision that had originally received draft plan approval for that large area, which has since lapsed. So there currently is no plan of subdivision for that block.
Okay.
And just to be clear, just for everyone's understanding, is that any future application to reconsider how that property will be developed is a public process. So there will be public consultation associated with that should an individual decide to put a proposal forth.
And that would also be true for the plot of land that's identified as 322? So there's no
Yes.
previous planned subdivision for 322, or is that the one off Jack Street?
If I may, Your Worship, what staff have referred to in the past as the Jack Joseph subdivision encompass both of those lands. It's just the way that the GIS shows the land configuration within the property is two separate. But the original plan of subdivision, which I believe was originally for 14 lots, if I recall, went through Joseph Street through to Jack, so there would have been a through road there.
Okay, but that has lapsed now.
That is correct.
Okay. So in other words, we don't know what could come forward there as a proposed. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Barkley?
Yeah, I guess my question is somewhat similar to Councillor O'Sullivan's in that I'm wondering how do we define underutilized? Is it street frontage, or is it the amount of coverage? I think Councillor O'Sullivan talked about 35%. Is it both, one or the other? Or?
Through Your Worship, there's not actually like an accepted planning definition of underutilized. It's site-specific and context-specific. On this property, where a home is built on one half and it provides the opportunity for, a future severance or some other type of development proposal, that would be something, in my opinion, that would be characterized as underutilized, but there's not like a stock definition, So,
but we also have a definition of intensity in terms of the number of units, dwelling units. Okay. Just a comment, if I might, Mayor Peckford. I mean, from the map that's up there, right there, it's obvious to me that there's lots of underutilized space, and with the provincial policy statement and our own official plan about intensifying, I think I see a lot more intensification happening, especially on these underutilized lots. And I think, settlement areas are restricted. We're trying to save farmland, and so it makes the provincial policy statement makes a lot of sense. I think we're going to see this kind of intensification, intensifying, if I might make that comment. So I'm generally supportive of this.
Okay. So Councillor O'Sullivan, Councillor Strachan, and then I think it will be time to hear from members of the public, some of whom have asked in their letters that they be given the opportunity to speak this evening. Councillor O'Sullivan, Councillor Strachan.
Okay, thank you very much, Your Worship. I think it's important that when there are infill buildings, that they do, look aesthetically pleasing and like they fit in with the style of homes in the rest of the neighborhood. I don't know how old this map is that we have up right now, but I think there was another lot, like it shows an empty lot almost across from this one that I believe already has a house on it. Is that? I think so. So, and I think it's a new house, right? Yeah. So I think that house there was concerns, because I recall when it was coming forward that there were concerns about how it would look in the neighborhood, etc. And I think it was built in a way that it fits in very nicely with the porch. And so I think if there's good consideration for things like that, when there are infills, and actually it looks like it fits well in there, and it's been there for a long time, even though I know it's new. So I think those are important things to be considered for sure. And anyway, I look forward to hearing what anyone else has to say now, and Councillor Strachan, I guess, is next.
Councillor Strachan?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Mayor. My questions are around parking. Our downtown area is plagued with parking issues, and so I think consideration for that needs to be part of this discussion, and I know it's come up from residents as well. The number of units for this development is 4, correct? Just confirming.
Through Your Worship, so there's 2 units in the existing home. The new severed portion would have 2 units, and then there'd be 2 accessory dwelling units within the basements of those. So all total, there'd be 4 units plus 2 others, 6.
And
Okay,
the 2
so
that
4
are there are existing?
2 are existing.
2 existing, and
Yes.
4 would be added.
Plus 4.
4 additional units. And the number of parking spots allocated for each one of those units is what?
Would be 1.
So I think that's highly unrealistic. I don't know what calculation is used for that, but I know most places that most folks are having to drive, and if you have more than one adult, there's often more than one vehicle. So I think that we're going to run into a situation where either there'll be too many cars parked on that lot, and they will find themselves in a situation where they're going to have to back out of that carriage laneway onto the road, which would be a significant safety consideration on many levels, or they would have to find on-street parking, and then we run into the same situation that we run into other locations in our downtown core. I'm not opposed to infill housing or the characterization of the rest of the build. I think my concern is mainly based on the safety and the reality of just what the parking situation could be, given what we know already of that area.
So maybe as a follow-up, I can just ask, in terms of parking, the allocation of one parking spot, Mr. Mosher, is based upon what? Is there a formula, right? Because I would say many homes in that area would likely have two, I would assume, most, right? Most Old Town Kempville streets that are kind of not super residentially intense, I would imagine, have two. So what's the logic for the rationale of one?
Whether it's logical or not, Your Worship, it's there's a zone standard for it.
Okay.
So there's a table within that says if it's this type of a unit, this is how much parking it requires.
I'm not saying it was not logical. I just was wondering what the logic is. So to your point, it's formula-based, and that's based upon the residential density designation?
Based upon zone standards. And
Okay.
if it's a single unit, then it requires one parking space.
Okay. Okay. So why don't anyone, oh, I apologize. Yes, so Councillor Sullivan, and then anyone who wishes to speak, you can come closer to the mic if you please. Okay, Councillor Sullivan.
Through you, Madam Mayor, to Mr. Mosher. So that standard for one parking spot per unit like this, is that standard across the whole province? Because like if that's the standard in Ottawa where you have public transportation available, that's a whole different ballgame than here where you don't. So a lot more people here need to drive. I mean, or bike, like I do, but that's not always possible if you're going a little further than B&H, you know. So I think that needs to be looked at in terms of where you live and what other forms of transportation are available.
I think there was a question, and I'm not familiar with Ottawa's parking standards. I am familiar with North Grenville's, so I can't really answer outside our jurisdiction.
Okay, so the question was that zoning that says one parking spot per house in this situation, is that standard across the province, or is that just here? Do we have control over that?
Yes, absolutely. Council has control over setting the zoning bylaw and the number of spaces. Currently, the zone standard is one per unit. And again, I don't know how other jurisdictions would handle it.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So that's our standard, if you will. Okay, good to know. Okay. Okay, so who wishes to speak? Okay, great. Okay, thank you. And if you could just state your name and address, that would be awesome. Very cumbersome. Just turn on the mic. It's the middle button. There you go.
Sorry.
That's okay. All good.
It's Ashlyn Lacombe, and I live at 10 Victoria Avenue. I guess I have a couple questions for the people, I mean, myself and Gary, who already live in the unit that's existing there now. If we have more than one vehicle, are we supposed to be getting rid of one of our vehicles, or how does that work out? And I'm not sure, that might be a question more for the tenant board, because I'm like, when I rented this property, I had a backyard, and that same goes for the underutilized space. We do use it. I have 3 kids, and the whole street is filled with children. So everybody comes down. We have a trampoline, we have a pool, all sorts of things that we're going to be using with this underutilized space that is very well utilized. So it's just a little bit frustrating when, you know, we have a whole street of kids. Where are they supposed to be now? As well as the whole parking issue. There's no way, like I occupy there's no way that you're going to have that many vehicles on that property. It's just not feasible. So I guess it wasn't really so much of a question, but just some more to bring sort of light to how it actually is on the street, that there's just absolutely no way there's going to be that parking. And I just think it should be known too that it's not an underutilized space. It's very well utilized by all the kids on the street, and we are a little bit concerned about the traffic. It already is, it's getting busier. Kempville's growing, we know that, but it's already hard, you know, when you're outside as a mom and you're telling everybody to slow down. And I just think, like these low-income housing things, I just don't think that that's going to be any benefit to the street at all. That was it. That wasn't a question. I just wanted to talk.
And just to be clear, I don't understand it to be a low-income initiative, right? I think I've assumed nothing has been disclosed to
Sorry,
us.
that was just what I had heard from
Okay.
the street, was that it was a low-income housing, so I'm not too sure.
Well, why don't we just ask staff to clarify? Is this characterized as a low-income development?
No.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think it's at market, right? But of course, it will attract renters if in fact, does anyone, Mr. Mosher, does the developer have to disclose? I think he's here, of course. Is it for purchase or for rent? Are these homes for purchase or for rent? Yes. Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Lockwood.
Hi, my name's
Hi.
Corey Lockwood and live at 2010 Totem Ranch Road. We're the owner of the retained parcel, or proposed retained, and the other parcel. It is currently, we are not 100% decided if we are going to rent the units or sell them as a semi-detached. They will be split, and we have not 100% decided if we're going to retain it and do that, or if we were going to sell each half. We're still working on the details for that. To Ashley's, and one thing I'd like to say to everybody here, historically when I've done this, I've gone around and knocked on all the doors, talked to all the neighbors. I didn't do it here, and I apologize to everybody that's in the room, because it can alleviate concerns beforehand, and I do apologize, and I've got no one to blame but myself, and I don't know why I missed it on this, but I did, and I do apologize. The current building will have 2 parking spots, the existing building. There will be allowed for 2 spots. There's an old barn on the property that's pretty dilapidated that'll have to come down. We're going to allow for a shed for each of those units to allow for it. And the new building will have, there'll be 4 indoor parking spaces in the back. There's double garage for each side, and then there'd be room outside if there was additional vehicles. My experience on it, we built an infill development across from Holy Cross Church. I no longer own that. It belongs to my ex-wife now. But that property there were 6 units there, and we never had 6 cars that was in those units. The apartments that were kind of in the basement for these were more geared to like if it was a family was to buy it, to have a parent live in the basement or that type of thing. We've built one on where my girlfriend lives currently on Aza Street. It was put a little 500 square foot apartment in the back, and it was an older lady that lived in it without a vehicle. And so it's not always that there's going to be 2 cars per unit, is my experience in it. So
Thank you.
that's all I have to say. And again, I apologize for not going around sooner.
So just to be clear, you're saying there's a double garage
Yeah.
anticipated for each of the,
Each units, yeah. The garages across the back will allow for 2 vehicles. They're smaller garage, but they do allow for 2 vehicles in each of the garages.
okay. So the allocation of 1 parking spot, Mr. Mosher, there's an allocated, I guess a stipulated 1 spot per dwelling, is that correct? Including the secondary units or the granny suites?
Yes.
Okay. And what I'm hearing Mr. Lockwood say is you are anticipating accommodating more.
Yes, so we've got, right now, there's a room going to be for 4 vehicles parked inside, and then there's a room in front of those garages for parking as well,
Right.
if needed.
Okay.
All right?
And the underutilized space that is referred to, is that the space that is part of the property you now own? When we
Yes.
talk about underutilized
Yes.
space? Okay.
Yes, that's because it's a 100-foot wide lot, and the building currently is on 50 feet of it.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so this is dormant land that obviously neighbors, right, are just sort of
Yes.
using
Yes.
because it's there.
Yes,
And kids like to run wherever they're going to run.
exactly.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. Okay, thank you. If you could just stick close by in case we have other questions. Welcome. I think we have someone else coming down.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Honorable Council. My name's Robert Moray. I live at 32 Victoria Avenue, which is down the street to the east of the property in question. I made some of the comments that Mr. Mosher brought forward were mine in terms of some of the questions I had. They are specific to the neighborhood service infrastructure. Specifically, when you read through the materials that were put in your package for this evening, you look at some of it and it refers to the fact that the basement apartments or dwellings would require a sump pump to make sure that they didn't have problems with flooding, and that they would be connected. Well, connected for our street without any storm sewers means that they would have to be connected to the sanitary sewers, which is against the rules and regulations of this municipality, from my understanding. So having that sort of as a question mark within the context of what's been submitted to you, I know and I understand, and Mr. Mosher addressed it with me just before the meeting, that that would be something that would be handled as part and parcel of the planning later on, but unfortunately we wouldn't be aware of that as the community, and that could have significant impacts on if it did get connected to sanitary, even as a temporary. It could flood basements with sewage, which might not be that great for us. And it's always a consideration for that. It's also the exterior. When you look at the base of the staircases that would be going to the front doors of these basement accesses, they would have to have a drain because of rain and everything else. So that, again, would be stormwater. So Mr. Mosher, again, addressed that to me just before the meeting, indicating that they, once the process, I guess, of a submission is made by the proposee for this, there would be a stipulation for them to bring stormwater to stormwater sewers or access to the stormwater sewers to the property. So rather than leave it as an open matter, given what has been proposed, should it not be addressed in the approval specifically? I think that would be easier for the community to understand and give us some comfort as well. And if it's the intention to do that, why not have it as part of the proposal?
Great. Can we stop you there just to tackle that one? So, Mr. Mosher, can you, I think some around this table are very passionate about drainage and stormwater sewers. And so why don't you fill us in a little bit more on what the plan is? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Your Worship, through the application process, it was circulated to the Public Works Department, so they provided specific comment, and the key point that they made was, you know, if you're developing a site, you're increasing impervious area that has the potential to discharge stormwater to neighboring sites. So within the province, when you're developing and intensifying, you have to demonstrate through an engineering exercise that post-development stormwater flows will not exceed the pre-development state. In other words, you're not discharging water off your site onto someone else's. And Mr. Murray is correct, and he did raise this with me via email at 4:30 today. I did have a chance to speak with the Director of Public Works. So there's not currently a storm sewer that is on this section of Victoria. So as the development proceeds, and it is traditional that following a zoning intensification process like this, there will be a site plan control agreement where these details are determined. And Mr. Murray is correct, that's traditionally not a public exercise. It's something that's handled through staff. At that point in time, engineering drawings and specifications have to be provided that demonstrate that there's no impact with off-site drainage. There'll be an appropriate lot grading and drainage plan that has to be prepared. And if ultimately a storm sewer is needed to be extended to the site, that would have to be at the cost of the developer to ensure that stormwater can connect into the storm pipe. At no point in time would stormwater be allowed to connect to the municipal sanitary system.
And don't we have the technology like in the world right now to kind of anticipate sort of water flows, right? Like, do we have to take the wait and see approach, I guess, to Mr. Morey's point? Like, shouldn't we have a good sense of whether or not additional, right, infrastructure is required, even if it's fairly modest?
Traditionally, for this type of an application, those details are normally addressed at the site plan stage. It's not to say that Mr. Morey's point is not valid. It's just that traditionally, once the land use has been established through a zone process, then the details of how it actually works are executed through a site plan control process.
I see. So it's at the site plan stage prior to the building being built?
Correct.
That this would, the identification of any additional measures would be identified and stipulated?
Before the building permit, yes.
Okay. Over to you, Mr. Murray.
Okay, thank you. Also, within this, it's related, the drainage, the current drainage in the area tends to go to this property. And so when we bring this through this development, bring it to grade, street grade, there would be obviously flows that would be different, and there would be a certain coverage. I think Councillor O'Sullivan made reference to that. The absorption, there's two different ways of stormwater being taken care of. One of them being through a sewer or a system, and also the actual absorption. So hence, when you intensify, you have less coverage or you have too much coverage from a standpoint of potentially absorption through the just aquifer or into the aquifer of the area. Currently, if you were to look at the property from the street, you would see it's probably at least a foot at the apex below the sidewalk. And so if you bring that up to a certain level, water will flow in different ways. There'll obviously be grading that will be put in place by the developer, but will it be sufficient so that there isn't flooding? And when you when you look at the design of things, you'll have the front part of the property on the street front taking up 1/3, as you mentioned, 35 or 34.2 something, and then you have a driveway, and then you have the garages in the back. So the actual grass or area for absorption of the water is minimalized, really. It's probably down to potentially 20%, 25% at that point. So that's a substantial difference relative to, so there's the coverage for the actual domiciles, and then there's the coverage for drainage purposes. So.
Okay, so just before going to Councillor Sullivan, I guess just to go down the drainage path one more time, Councillor Sullivan might too. Do we rely on, to what extent are we relying on properties, right, dormant or occupied, to be part of that drainage infrastructure, right? Because I could obviously see the concern, right? You put another building on what has been part of an assumed sort of drainage, not plan, but drainage, in effect, de facto plan, for lack of a better word. So what's that balance, right? Because I understand the concern about the loss of property that might absorb some of that water historically. Maybe that's not always in the way that you've described, Mr. Moray. Maybe there's many different properties that absorb some of that water, but how do we see that?
Thank you, Your Worship. While I'm not an engineer, I think that gets at the heart of the Public Works comment that was received in the pre-consultation of this, is that the post-development flows need to equal the pre-development state. And so there is a calculation that's done. And again, not being an engineer, but in my experience, it accounts for hardened surfaces on the site and the mix between hardened surfaces, including driveway spaces or buildings or structures, as well as pervious surfaces such as vegetation or others. So that accounting takes place.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, Councillor Sullivan.
Thank you. Just to clarify, thank you, Madam Mayor, for Mr. Mosher and Mr. Morey. I think the 34-point-something% lot coverage includes the garage and the building, the home, right? Yeah, so those two combined,
Okay, but not the driveway.
not the driveway, no.
No, because that's the permeable or
Right,
non-permeable
right.
surfaces.
But the garage is
Yeah.
part of that
Okay.
34%.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then I just had a question, and then Mr. Murray, back over to you. Mr. Lockwood, can you confirm, are the granny suites, will they be part of what you potentially rent or put up for sale? Is the granny suite a feature of the dwelling, or will it be its own separate abode, if you wish?
It'd be its own separate home with its own separate entrance.
Okay, okay.
The stormwater will be handled on site. We've done multiple of these units
Indeed.
without storm sewer there. Generally done by burying clear stone down below the surface.
So this is valuable information. So why don't we'll finish here, and then we'll ask you to do a comment, because I think your information should be mic'd so that anyone watching at home can hear you. Okay, over to you, Mr. Murray.
Okay, thank you. That's a good segue into my next question that I hadn't been able to address to anybody, was the reason for having separate zoning for this specific property when we have other properties in the neighborhood that have granny suites, and they're still zoned R1, non-conforming, I think. So why do we need to go with an R2 designation relative to this site?
Great question. Mr. Mosher?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, so for this property, in order to facilitate a semi-detached, it has to go through that zoning amendment. You cannot, the residential first density, R1, only allows a single detached within the zone rules. So in order to allow a semi as proposed by the applicant, the R2 is the next step up in terms of zone category.
Okay. And so I believe from what I've experienced with the other properties that were dealt with at one point, you can specify that the R2 is limited to what has been approved under the site plan, correct? You don't have to just change the zoning to an R2 and have all characteristics of an R2 zoning be applicable to that. You can specify and regulate.
I think I understand the question, Your Worship. I think you're saying, can you sort of tailor the zone to like meet the specific development? Is that the nature of the? Yes, that's correct, and that's what the applicant is proposing here.
Okay, thank you. The drainage, parking, we've already dealt with that, so I had some concerns relative to the existing semi-detached having only 2 spots when they've had more than that in their use of that site before. And so that's probably a good indicator of what would be normal, and I think it will be difficult for the way it's drawn right now for them to not have, being somebody who has a single access driveway, there's a time every evening when we get our drivers out and we adjust our cars. And so if you've got a number of people doing that in 2 semi-detached, and they're not family, whereas we are family, and so you're adjusting 3 or 4 cars in the driveway every evening. That's going to be interesting, especially in the wintertime when we have snowbanks and the limitation on parking on the street from 7 to 7. So I just put that out there as a point to reinforce some of the conversation earlier. The last point that I wanted to bring out was the concept on the preservation of Old Town Kemptville. I think it was again addressed at length already, so I won't comment any further on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Mr. Lockwood, maybe just, if you'd like, you can just address the drainage issue in particular. And if there's anyone else wishing to speak this evening, please make your way to the mic, and we'll do another round with council colleagues. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lockwood.
No problem. So the home that was, the new home built across the street, we built that home a year ago. Same type of deal. We had to deal with the stormwater on the site and the pre and post flows that Phil was talking to. And how we dealt with it on that site is by burying a perforated pipe in the ground surrounded by clear stone, and it's all done by engineers to calculate the area that's grassed and not grassed. And then, so when you get a big storm event, that water goes down into the ground and then slowly drains out through the ground. On the site, you can see now there's 2 white pipes that we've been monitoring for the last 6 months. The engineers go in and check it every so often to see how the drain water is, or the natural groundwater is, and that all gets taken into the calculation. So the grassed areas that are in the back will have that stormwater management will be all buried underneath it. You won't see it. Again, we've done it across the road. If you look at those Perkins Mills apartments, that little gazebo looks like a bridge going into the underneath that is 8 feet deep of clear stone that handles all the stormwater from the site. This site currently doesn't take the water off the street. There's a sidewalk down that side, so that it's not taking stormwater off the street, where some sites you do have to deal with that, but this isn't one of them.
Okay,
Right.
thanks. So why don't you, who else would like to speak? Okay, just give me a sec. Before you go, Mr. Lockwood, council colleagues, anything else for Mr. Lockwood or staff before we go to the next resident? Okay.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Moray. You were speaking my language when you talked about drainage and stormwater control on properties. Question, this might be a question for Public Works, but we recently went through design guidelines and related engineering standards, and I'm wondering, through you, Madam Mayor, to the Director of Planning, if she recalls any provisions for a more permeable driveway surface. I've seen honeycomb structures. I don't know whether that's something we've considered, and this is a question also to Mr. Lockwood, whether he's familiar with that kind of honeycomb driveway treatment that would increase the permeability of the site. Mr. Lockwood, I think you want to tackle that first? Okay.
So I am very familiar with it. They don't work great in our climate because of frost issues and whatnot, and then sanding of driveways, so that over time they get themselves blocked up quite a bit. I have looked into it, and that's the reason you don't see much of it in this neck of the woods. You'd see more like in the south and that, where you don't have to deal with frost.
Thank you. I think maybe Mr. Lockwood answered that for you.
Through your worship to Councillor Barkley, just to answer the question in regards to our design guidelines. I can't really speak more to the engineering side, but I can say that in our planning standards that we did adopt, there is consideration and encouragement to use building methods, including on-site, that encourages more pervious surfaces to allow for that percolation of stormwater and rainwater. So certainly it's a design feature that we do encourage, and then the engineering side would speak to that. So anytime there's a design proposal in regards to different types of surfaces, we do review it from an engineering perspective to see how that works from the stormwater side. So certainly we do encourage a wide variety of different methods for construction, and as appropriate, we review the engineering for what is proposed. Thank you.
Just going back to parking quickly, and unless I see other hands, we can go to the next resident. Is there a way to anticipate other parking possibilities on the property? Is there? It's not quite obvious to me. It's great to hear about the garages, but I'm just wondering, is there another way to anticipate any sort of overflow parking? We understand, and many concerns have been raised to us about the 3-hour parking bylaw, which hadn't really been enforced for a number of years, but resurged, I guess is a word, in terms of enforcement. This past summer, we know we have strict prohibitions on overnight parking during the winter months. So I'm just wondering, Mr. Lockwood, what's the possibility of accommodating overflow, if you will?
Well, both sites would accommodate overflow parking. You would just have to, like the gentleman before said, you'd have to move some cars to get one out possibly, but they would, you could park like 8 cars on the new site and 4 cars on the existing site, but you're gonna have to move some cars to get some in and out. That would be a fact of it, for sure.
Okay, just wanted to ask a question. Thank you. Councillor Sullivan.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I don't know, I can't direct this question to anyone in particular, but unless Councillor Strachan is aware of, so the new area in Kempville, which has been intensified, Country Walk, there's a lot of homes in there. They all only have a single car garage, and so the second vehicle, should they have one, has to be parked in the laneway. So I don't know if there's been any reported concerns in Country Walk, for example, of parking on the street or any problems with that. Are you aware of anything from Bylaw? No, I guess actually Bylaw's now under Director Martin, so either one of you, are you aware of any issues with parking in those places?
Through your worship to Councillor Sullivan, I would have to follow up with bylaw staff. I'm not aware personally of any complaints that we would have received in Country Walk. A majority of our complaints are more so kind of more directly in the downtown and around Prescott Street and Clothier Street.
Thank you.
Let's welcome the next resident and then regroup. Someone else wishing to speak?
Sorry, first time. Thank you, Your Worship, Council. Jesse Stewart, 213 Van Buren Street. Thank you so much for your time. Just listening to the comments today, I've tried to organize my thoughts as best as possible to dovetail in what's already been covered, so I'm not being too redundant. I just wanted to say it's nice to make all of your acquaintance, recognizing my neighbors as well, those I've met, those I haven't. I recognize from the sign-in sheet, most of them are from Victoria Street specific. I'm from the other side of the block, Van Buren, so I do have, albeit equal but different point of view on the development of all of this. So if I will, I'll just, not to sound too formal, I'll just go by the notes I've written, so I'm not wasting anyone's time. I need to use the washroom and running late, so. The artist rendition that I was shown is a building that's in contrast with quite a few of the surrounding homes. Despite the preservation of the neighborhood that was cited, I'm kind of wondering a couple things. How does this differentiation of the building construct with the surrounding neighborhood sit with our current council? The fact it was quoted as being in compliance, how was this determined, and can we access the process that was used to determine as much? Certainly that might not be presented tonight, but if that could be made available, I'd like to see how that compare and contrast was made, because having grown up in that neighborhood and then having recently returned very proudly, it doesn't seem to jive from what I've seen. Intensification is certainly a buzzword in our provincial government. However, being a provincial buzzword, municipal affairs are by definition more localized element. And so I'm wondering what steps we're taking to ensure the level of such endeavors reflect the wishes of North Grenville's constituents. It might be a provincial goal. Is it necessarily a goal of this township or of the townsfolk that we need to intensify at every degree possible this town? I'm not so sure that that's necessarily the case. If it is, are such endeavors consistent with other potential projects? In the particular case of what we're discussing tonight, there's ongoing intensification of Van Buren Street, where I live. Already quite prominent intensification has taken place, and I understand there's projects that come down the pipe. So are things happening in Van Buren Street being one of the primary routes closest to this address? Are those being taken into consideration when we look at intensification? Councillor Mosher, these are not loaded questions. I'm not looking for them to sound as much. But I had heard the quote parking in response to Your Worship. It wasn't that it's necessarily logical, but that's the formula. Do we blindly follow such formulas that are assigned to us? Just because something is a formula, does that mean that we have to follow it? The question was, granted, you had clarified, Your Worship, was it logical? The answer was, I don't know if it's logical, but that's the formula. That to me was a red flag that maybe we need to take a second look at that. Just because it's a formula doesn't necessarily mean it's something we should be following. To Mr. Lockwood, the developer, I can attest that the building he was referring to across from Holy Cross is a beautiful one. My mother lives in it. The one parking space per unit was a formula that works. It's worth noting that of those 6 units, if I'm not mistaken, anyone here is more than free to correct me, at least 5 of those 6 units are have widows as their residents. It's a one person, one unit formula in that building. I've, from personal experience, had to park on the street, and from personal experience have seen people have to even ask the neighbors to park. So to use past experience as far as the recipe for parking per unit, that recipe didn't seem to weather out so well in my own personal experience. On that note, having grown up on the block of said space that we're talking about tonight, I've personally seen garbage trucks struggle. That was actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Confirmed by a neighbor of mine that I know who happens to be here tonight, who also witnessed the same thing, that we've seen struggles of municipal services, the struggle of getting through of current parking on Victoria Avenue. To compound that with additional cars that would be inevitable with the current plans, I think would add quite a few headaches to those living on that street and surrounding streets, because let's be honest, there's a domino effect to these types of things. One street flows onto another. The last point, number 5, that I'd like to bring up was just that there are, I would think, in this town, well-known, well-documented mixed feelings and thoughts about the further development on the interior of the Victoria North, Jack East, Van Buren South, Joseph West, aka the Jack Joseph route. There's mixed feelings about what might happen on the interior of said block, and I would like to understand the further implications of this development and what that would mean for any potential future developments or cancellations of plans on the interior of that block, if that was something that could be made known publicly, and how that was deciphered, that would be much appreciated. And I thank you for my time.
Thank you. So maybe, Mr. Mosher, you can go first to, if planning staff are aware of that interior of that block that was slated for some sort of development at some point. I don't know if you can disclose the status of that.
Thank you, Your Worship. So, as mentioned earlier in the meeting, there was a previous plan of subdivision for that larger empty space between Jack Street and Joseph Street for, again, I believe 14 single residential units. That has since lapsed. At this time, we don't have an application before staff that we can disclose as to what the end goal is for the redevelopment of that lot, and until such a time that we receive an application, it's only speculation as to what could be done. So like I mentioned earlier, any proposed plan to redevelop those lots would require a public meeting, whether there's a zoning required or a plan of subdivision. Again, that's a public process, and neighbors are also notified.
And when a plan lapses, it means it starts from scratch again, correct?
That is correct, Your Worship.
Okay. And does that interior section of land require rezoning in order to proceed? I presume it would.
Without the benefit of looking at the zoning map, I believe the zoning was our residential first density, so R1. So any intensification beyond single detached dwellings, or any redesign of that, even if it was hypothetically still single detached dwellings and there was zone standard changes to lot configuration, would require a zoning. And again, that is a public process that requires public notice.
Okay. Just in terms of parking, because obviously there's been some clarification that the parking allotments are more than one, though I think to the gentleman's point, of course, this is a made in North Grenville, right, set of parameters, so it could be updated. If Mr. Lockwood is saying, in fact, there's 2 parking spots or 3, again, I guess a double garage, which could accommodate the primary and the secondary unit, or just the primary, Mr. Lockwood? Okay, 1 spot for each in the garage. And then is there accessory parking in the back? Did I hear that? Is that the idea? Yes. Okay. Is that a stipulation now? You're telling us that's what you're planning. Is there a way to encode that or enshrine that in any agreement moving forward, Mr. Mosher? So that we, raise the bar effectively, given what Mr. Lockwood is saying?
Yes, council can, if they wish, your worship, amend the zoning to say this will be the parking provision for this specific context.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And then in terms of intensification, it's a very big philosophical, I think, discussion about what the province expects of the municipalities, what municipalities expect of themselves, and what residents are seeking. And I just anecdotally can say, of course, there's an urgent need for all kinds of housing, not just affordable housing, all kinds of housing in North Grenville. And one of the things that's been, I think, challenging for us as a community is when seniors can't, sell homes and find other accommodations that might be more modestly sized or connected to family and what have you. So we've always, I think, understood the value of secondary suites to be ones where someone's given an opportunity to potentially house a loved one, whether they be sort of at the beginning of their adult lives or perhaps at their end. I'm not saying in this case that's how it will play out, but certainly I know the value of secondary units or granny suites, whatever you want to call them, has typically been to see if we can facilitate some additional accommodations in North Grenville. But I don't know if council colleagues or staff want to comment on the intensification question. I see another resident wishing to speak, but I'll just quickly go to council colleagues. Councillor Barclay.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. As a fast-growing community, it's not only the rate of growth that we're dealing with, but managing that growth. And there's a lot of concerns, a lot of great questions have been raised on this particular development. And again, we are constantly trying to play a game of catch-up. We're undergoing a parking study, which, is just underway, haven't completed yet. Stormwater master plan has been contracted. I don't think it'll drill down to this level, but, we're looking at how to manage stormwater, having a master plan for the urban service area as well as the rural areas. And so again, the challenge is how do we deal with this? And so I understand the concerns of residents to see this change and how rapid it's changing. And yes, we can have control over certain elements of it. But again, you're talking about private property, and we can't say you're going to develop this kind of building here and that kind of building there. There are some restrictions under the Zoning Act, and that's why we have to change the zoning here. So it is a real challenge, and I understand people's concerns, but part of this public process is informing the neighbors and telling them within what parameters do we have that we can move. So it's just a general comment that I find these meetings very difficult because we're constantly playing catch up of how to manage this growth and how to control it. So it's best for everybody. They're not making any more new land. The province says this is the area that you've got to build homes on. More and more people want to live here, so we have to look at intensification. How we do that, that's a difficult question, how we do it, but it's happening. Intensification is happening. Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Strachan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And just a general comment, I think I don't have any questions, but I'm looking at this concept plan that's up here, and if we assume that the proposed garage is somewhere close to a car size, you know, you don't really have much paved area outside of those garages to put additional vehicles. You know, technically they could fit there, but you'd be constantly moving vehicles around, and to assume that everybody in those dwellings will want to play that shuffle every night between themselves, I think is unrealistic. You know, adding more space for parking will come at a cost of yard space. And so then you cut out of, you know, the enjoyment of a space that you could have more of a yard. So I think there has to be a balance struck. And I don't think the issue is whether or not you can fit more cars in there. It's what do you want the trade-offs to be? And I think from a municipal perspective, our approach to on-street parking and so on is currently under review and is, you know, has not been resolved. And I think, I'll say this and perhaps regret the words, but I think it's irresponsible for us to ignore the potential parking issues that will come out of this if we continue to say, oh, it's only one per dwelling, and then we rinse and repeat the same problems that we've had throughout the rest of the downtown core. So I think that that's a not insignificant challenge that we need to overcome. Having said that, intensification in the right place is, you know, where you want more houses, you don't want to take up farmland or other land outside of town to continue to build more houses. Intensification has its purpose. So just what that balance is, if this was 2 dwellings, we wouldn't be having a parking conversation, but it's not, it's 4. And I think that that's in part where the challenge lies. And I know that there's lots of good reasons to make it 4 and what that can offer, but it still increases the number of, realistically, the number of adults that you'll have there and the high risk of additional vehicles and what that will mean for parking. So again, not a question, but just a follow-up comment to what we've been talking about all along. Thank you.
Okay.
My name is Ben Thompson. I live at 19 Victoria Avenue, across the street from the proposed development. So, I mean, it's been talked at length, just in regards of the traffic and the parking, how many kids are there. Just off top of my head, you're looking at about 19 kids that play on that street on a daily basis. And to my understanding as well, it's Victoria Avenue, not Victoria Street. And the reason it's an avenue is because it's not wide enough to be deemed a street. There's already a parking issue along the street, along the street as it is. And I think, you know, putting 4 more units in there, whether you have 1 spot or 2 spots, there's still going to be parking on the street, because you might have a bigger vehicle that doesn't fit into the driveway, doesn't fit into the garage itself. They might have to be playing musical cars, trying to get in and out. So I don't really think that it's going to be addressed either way, because there's going to be parking on the street no matter what. And the street already is crowded enough because it is quite narrow. To Mr. Stewart's point, there was issues with garbage trucks going up and down the street because it is so narrow. There's already an increase of traffic flow up and down the street without any added new homes in there, just because of the growth of the area, which is understandable because people are moving Kempville a lot more. To the point of Councillor O'Sullivan's point with the new house, there were a neighbor of ours who severed their lot and built a new house. I would disagree that it fits in with our neighborhood, because our neighborhood has a lot of older homes. My home is 100 years old. It was built in 1900. That looks nothing like my home in Old Town, historic Kempville. Porch or not, it's still a brand new home. Same thing with this. It's not going to fit in. It's not going to look. No matter what the facade is, it's still not going to look part of the avenue and the old town of Kempville. So that's just my feelings. Another issue that hasn't really been mentioned was my backyard actually touches the Jack Street development. And I know myself, as well as other neighbors on the avenue, we experienced a very large rat infestation once the construction uprooted a lot of the field behind us. And that's another concern with another construction right across the street. I mean, it's health and safety right there. Having rats in my house, around my small kids, around neighbors, kids, it was just difficult to get rid of them. And we had never had that problem. I've been there for 11 years, and we had never had that problem until there was new construction. And I'm not saying it's strictly just new construction. There are other variables that obviously happened, but the new construction definitely uprooted their home. Same thing that's going to happen across the street, and I would raise that as a major concern as well, because it's a large enough lot for them to do, what, a 4-unit now? I would raise that issue as well. As well, to another point Mr. Stewart made, this is another plan. This is a different plan that I have seen originally, and I understand that you have to change plans to, make everything work and make everything fit. My main concern, though, is what happens if we zone it to an R2 and then go to this plan? Does that mean that this plan is then the finalized plan? Or does that mean that the plan can be revised and then we move to a bigger unit and a bigger building where we have more units? And then we're right back to square one arguing about kids and parking and traffic again on a very narrow avenue. So I just ask, where does it stop at, from an R1 to an R2? I understand that we're trying to find room in an already existing area of Kemptville, but if you look at actually all the lots around Victoria Avenue, Van Buren Street, James and Jack, a lot of those have a lot of big backyards. That's a very big selling feature as well. Going back to the amount of kids, I mean, there's a ton of kids that do play in all those backyards. And I understand we're trying to intensify each and, use all of our space. But at the same time, I mean, what's the benefit of having no backyard and no space for kids to grow up in? Are we just trying to minimize everything and just put everything in together? And I understand that we are trying to increase people coming to Kemptville, but at what point is it too much, right? That's pretty much it, what my main concerns are. Because, I mean, the parking, again, it's talked at length, but there is going to be parking on the street no matter what. It is a very narrow street to begin with. Construction vehicles are already going to go up and down with the kids already there. You're going to have 4 units, maybe 2 cars each. It's another 8 cars on that street. I'm just raising the concern. And again, to another point, if we go to R2, does that mean that this plan is the final plan, and there's not going to be another change in the plan to go to another R3 or whatever? So those are some of my concerns. I don't know who I would address that to, but.
I got it. I can help. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So just Mr. Mosher, I know we talked earlier about the provision, about the possibility of a holding provision, which I think is a mechanism through which some of the concerns being expressed around, changing nature of the development or the capacity to be clear about what we're allowing and not necessarily open the door, right, to other features that haven't been discussed here or other secondary units on the property, et cetera. Can you speak to the holding provision? Because I think it responds to some of Ben's questions in terms of, is this it? Like, what is it we're dealing with?
Yeah, through you, Your Worship. Yeah, so a holding zone is something that can be used to say, like, all right, there might be other studies and things, a number of things have been discussed tonight that would be required before the development proceeded. And, the things that are already going to be needed is through the site plan control, those engineering details and stuff like that. So it is possible that through a holding provision, you could say, but before the hold gets lifted from the zone category, from R2, to allow the building to be constructed, that you have to have that information in place first. So certainly that's an option that's available. With respect to, if this does become R2, is that it? So R2 limits it to semi-detached, and anybody who's got an existing home or an existing semi-detached has the right to construct a basement unit in it. But the proposal we're dealing with is to go to R2. It's not to go to R3 or R4. Nothing stops somebody in the future from, looking at this site for other intensification. That's not what's on the table tonight, but anybody has an opportunity to make those applications under the Planning Act.
So just to clarify, and I understand we're going from R1 to R2, that's the plan. So what you're saying, just to clarify, is there is a possibility that if we go from R1 to R2, that we could again go to R2 to R3?
Through you, Your Worship, not in this process today.
No, not right now, I'm saying in the future.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical.
It is.
Yeah, so.
I mean, if this was denied tonight, we could be here 2 months from now going from an R1 to an R3, right? Anything is possible, I'm assuming, in terms of an application coming forward in the future.
Yes,
that
absolutely. And any application has to be vetted through the provincial policy statement, the local official plan, the county's official, same process that this one has gone through, right? Okay. So if that was the case, and everybody would get notice, similar to the discussions that have been had on the Jack Joseph subdivision, which had lapsed, so.
Okay. You had a couple of other questions there.
I just wanted to end on, I would really urge everyone here tonight to really actually take note of how many people are here from the actual affected area and how strongly we feel about it and how passionate we are, because we are all here in number to voice our concern. And I would just ask that you really do take a look at that and see it's not just one or two people you're affecting families, people that have been here for 40 years on the street. And I would just ask that you look at that as well. Thank you for my time. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else wishing to speak? I think so. Okay. Yes. Sure, let's take a break. Okay, so we're going to take, are you okay if we take 3 minutes? Okay, you stay there. Make yourself comfortable. Okay. Okay. No problem. Okay, I know you're all having fun. It's great to see people connect, but we probably should get back to business. I think there's a block party down the street. I mean, down the road, down the avenue. Somebody's going to host a block party. Who's it going to be? Okay. Discuss amongst yourselves. Okay. Okay, so we're going to, is there anyone else who's wishing to speak here? Okay. Okay, so we're going to, if you don't mind, colleagues, why don't we hear, I think, the last two, if I'm not mistaken, and then we'll take it back for deliberation on this side of the house. Okay, go ahead. Can you just restate your name? Thank you.
Glenneberg, 315 Joseph Street. I've lived there for the last 24 years.
Okay.
I think most of the people that live in that area have moved into that area because of the nature of that area. It is an old, established neighborhood with beautiful older homes, and it is seeing a resurgence of new people as our older population are slowly leaving. Just like Jesse, he's now in his mom's house redoing it. It's seeing a resurgence. One thing, well, a couple of things, in comment to the new house that was built on the severed property at the top of Victoria, that was the Lockwood home. Although it's a beautiful home, I absolutely would say. I think it's too big for the lot. It gives absolutely no backyard. And as somebody who lives next door to a neighbor who just sold her house, the comments for her not selling her house earlier were the fact that there was no backyard and no garage. So people are coming out and looking for a bit more space than you would get in Barrhaven. That's why they're not choosing to live in Barrhaven. They're coming out to Kemptville because of the type of people that are out in Kemptville. It is a quieter, lower paced, more relaxed atmosphere. When it comes to the parking, absolutely, you're going to have people. It's great to say that there's garages, but look around at any new development. People don't use the garage, they use it as storage, and that's the reality of it. That is absolutely the reality, so those cars have to go somewhere. And if there's a mom and dad in that house, or a Mr. and Mrs., they're each driving their own vehicle, and they're probably driving into Ottawa to work. And so that's two per household that you're proposing. We all know that the land is going to get developed. Everyone knows that, you know, the vacant land is eventually going to be developed. Nobody is saying it's not. But why does it have to go to R2? Why can't it be a beautiful home? Why can't a beautiful home populate, which would fit into that neighborhood? If all those developments, if that development goes in, where's all that snow going to go? Where's that snow going to go? I have a big property with a big driveway, and I found it hard to move some of the snow. They're going to have nowhere to put it, let alone the cars. It's, you know, we're here because we care, and that's the gist of it. We care, we know it's going to be developed, but we will also want to see it be developed properly. And people chose that area to live in with their kids, and that's, you've got new families coming in with kids, like the First Lady who spoke. She's raising her kids, and her kids are in a great neighborhood where they can literally be out on the street. I remember being back here, and whatever changes you make to this development is going to affect the development in the back of my house, because you bet your pants that as soon as they realize that they've changed the zoning on this, then they tried to put the retirement home in my backyard. The proposed first drawing of that one was going to be a story higher than all of the houses, and that was the first thing that they had proposed. So that sticks in my mind. So you can quickly go from an R1 to a much bigger fish. Everyone was tremendously relieved when it didn't happen, but whatever happens here, whatever decisions get made here, will affect that lot on Jack and Joseph. So, thank you.
All right. We'll welcome the last comment. Thanks. And then close the public meeting.
My name is Samantha Levitt. I co-own the property at 3005 Joseph, which backs onto this property with my husband. I did want to issue initially a clarification that I had sent an email previously to the planning department, not so much a letter of objection as questions. So I wanted to register that I have no formal objection to the R2 and a kind of a mild intensification process. But I did have several concerns, many of which have been discussed already. Just to add on to that I fully empathize and support the tenant that is there already that's concerned about her kids being able to play in the backyard. Having my backyard back onto their backyard, I see their kids out there every day. So they're definitely making use of that space. But I did also want to clarify just kind of a few more technical questions with regard to the R2 zoning. If that entails any differences in our property taxes or lighting on the street, as we are seeing more light pollution in our neighborhood, whereas previously we had really gotten a good view of the stars. And so I just wanted to see if that was affected at all by the change in zoning on this property.
Mr. Mosher?
I can't, through you, Your Worship, I can't really speak to any impact for property taxes. And then in terms of lighting, I don't know if there's anything scheduled. I believe Victoria Avenue, speaking with Public Works Department, eventually is due for like an upgrade or a rebuild. I don't know when that would be. This development does not propose any new lights.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for coming down. Appreciate it. Okay, so seeing no other comments from the public, do I have that right? Okay, we are going to close the public meeting at, sorry, lost my track of time. Okay, council colleagues, we have a recommendation, as you know, to proceed from staff, but given comments and dialogue, I'll look to anyone for a motion or on how we wish to proceed this evening. Councillor Strachan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think that there are many comments and concerns that have been raised tonight, and given by the number of residents who have shown up to discuss their concerns this evening, I don't feel comfortable with moving forward with the plan as it is proposed today. I think there are many areas that should be considered and many questions that need to be answered. So I would look to move for a deferral of the decision on this property until we can get further clarity and answers to this question.
All right, for that to be a live motion, it needs a seconder. Is there a seconder for the motion? Councillor Wilson. Okay. So motion is on the table. So discussion at this stage, comments, or shall I call a vote? Councillor Barkley.
Yeah, certainly we've heard a lot of comments from residents here about the change to the neighborhood. I've had a couple of conversations with them during the break and before the meeting about change coming and our need to manage change. To the motion on the table, I'm wondering what questions do we want answered? I would say drainage comes to mind. Mr. Morey brought up some interesting questions about stormwater. Mr. Lockwood did supply his solution to how to handle that surface runoff. But I would just ask mover and seconder what other answers they would like brought back.
Councillor Strachan as a mover, and then Councillor Wilson.
I think perhaps I've already said parking about 15 times tonight, and I think parking's a serious one. I'm not making fun of your comment, Councillor Barkley, but I think that the parking question does need to be answered. There isn't a solution on the table right now, other than, you could put more in there if you needed to, and you could shuffle around and so on. I don't think that that's a workable situation. I think all of us have heard from many residents in the downtown core about just how atrocious parking can be, to the point of the last few residents who came up here, garages aren't necessarily used for cars, so I think we need to be realistic about what that actually means. We don't have anything in place that would change the parking situation as it is right now that would allow for it to be better. And then again, pushing it out into the street I don't think is necessarily the right solution. And as I mentioned previously, you can use up more yard space for parking, but then what are you trading off there as well? So I would just say parking would be another one that I would like an answer to.
Okay, parking, Councillor Barclay.
So parking, would we be deferring this to after the parking study has been completed and presented to council? Are we talking about deferring? How long to when?
I think it would be at the discretion of forthcoming council to revisit the decision. Obviously, I think Mr. Lockwood, as owner of the property, is likely keen to understand its fate at some point. So I don't know if deferrals typically have a stipulation. Ms. Workman, can you speak to that?
I would actually look to Director Martin for this
Ms.
one.
Martin?
Thank you, Your Worship. So under the Planning Act, there is no requirement when there is a deferral of a decision in regards to a zoning bylaw amendment when it has to arise back to council. Certainly, a direction can be given via resolution, but there's no stipulation that you have to set an exact date as to when it has to come back.
And while we have you on the parking study, where are we at? Because that appears to be particularly salient.
So that is a fantastic question for the Director of Corporate Services, as that is a project that's under her portfolio. Okay. I will endeavor to raise that question with her and have her circulate a response to council.
Okay. Do you expect by the end of this year, or are you just guessing? You don't know?
I don't want to speak out of turn, as it truly is Ms. Janot's project.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Councillor Barclay, go ahead.
Along that line, through you, Madam Mayor, I wonder if I could direct a question to the Director of Public Works.
She does happen to be here now.
Yeah.
So, Ms. Dunlop, feel free to come down. Thanks.
And this is related to my question about stormwater management.
Indeed.
Thanks.
Okay. So why don't you ask the question while Ms. Dunlop is coming down?
Yes. My question is about the water master plan. Like, what level of granularity are we looking at? I mean, are we getting down to, do we expect out of the stormwater master plan to have a recommendation in terms of creating a storm sewer along Victoria, for example? Is that the kind of thing we expect out of the stormwater master plan, or is it a much higher level kind of document?
It will identify deficiencies, through your worship. It will identify deficiencies within the serviced area itself, absolutely. But we still have outstanding 4 streets that have been designed in a draft format for rehabilitation. Victoria, Mary, Elizabeth, Joseph have all the draft designs for rehabilitation, just like Jack Street was completed, Asa Street was completed. So storm, water, sanitary, curbs, sidewalks are all items that will be completed, as well as a rehabilitation and replacement of the asphalt surface. So those are things that we are completing as funding is available.
So just a follow-up, so we don't have to wait for the stormwater master plan to look specifically at Victoria Avenue. It's a budgetary question that could arise even as early as next year.
There will be an order of events because water flows downhill, but Joseph Street would be the, Joseph and Thomas would be the next ones in the mix, although Victoria does directly, by design, flow into Jack Street. Jack Street does have upgraded sanitary, storm, and water that was completed. I'm sorry, but my memory does not specifically pick out the year, but within the last decade.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, motion on the table. Any other questions, concerns? Thank you, Councillor Wilson, go ahead.
Through you, Madam Mayor. One of the reasons why I'd like to defer this, and I believe intensification is important. Housing density is important, but we have other areas in our municipality that we're currently looking at that, and there's areas that have been designated that way. The real reason, or in my opinion, this area is a bit of a heritage, older area of town, and I would like to see us keeping some of our heritage areas in our community and preserving the historic values of them. That's all. Thanks.
Okay. Any further comment? And then I'll call the vote. Councillor Sullivan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's a comment. It's my feeling that this is a difficult and sensitive situation. I think that having smaller homes and making good use of the land is really important. I think it's important that we're consistent in making decisions. I think as we look at intensification in the older area of downtown where there are no parks, and it's been brought up that there are a number of children who live on this street, and as older residents are moving out and younger people are moving in, we're getting families, and if we're chopping down the big backyards, then we've got to make a place where kids have space to kick a ball around if the backyard has gotten smaller and they can't kick a ball around. So it's a difficult situation. I think if people chose not to park in their garage and use it as a storage shed, that's their choice. And if they utilize their parking spot by filling it up with stuff, that's again their choice, and then they're stuck without a parking spot. So it's tricky. It's really, really tricky. I think we have a lot of areas where there's been buildings like this, semi-detached with secondary residences. I think I can think off the top of my head of 4 of them that are in the established area of Kemptville, and they, in fact, in one of them, the whole entire front yard is parking because they don't have any garages. So I wouldn't want to see 4 cars parked in the front of this. I think that really would not look good in the neighborhood. I think the elevation sketch I've seen that it would fit in. I think we need to address the parking situation, and that would be one question I would want to look at. But I think it's not fair, too, to give indefinite amount of time before Mr. Lockwood and his company can make a decision to proceed. So all in all, it's very... it's a kind of feel like I'm in a rock and a hard place here because I understand the need for intensification, but I think we need to look at establishing some parks in the older areas if we're going to continue to do this. And I think we need to look at the parking situation and make sure that there's enough place to park cars without having street parking, because that doesn't work in the winter for sure. So I think if we're going to defer this, I would like to see a timeline attached to it. And that's my opinion right now, so that we can look at that.
I do have a comment about the deferral timeline, but prior to mentioning making that comment, I suppose my question is related to garage parking, and this is, I don't know, Director Martin, if you're aware of this. My understanding is that we don't have it written into, I don't know where it would be written, into our bylaws that says that garage spots must be used for vehicles. Like, I think we've had this conversation, I believe I had it with Chief Oakham when bylaw was under his responsibility, that was part of the limitations of what we're dealing with right now with our capacity to say you have enough parking because you have to use your garage space effectively. Is that still correct? Is my understanding correct?
That understanding is correct. In our zoning bylaw, we don't identify the garage space to be considered a parking space unless there's a very site-specific provision that says so. In my understanding, within our subdivision agreements, we currently don't include covenants which address the garage space as being a parking space. However, as we're starting to see more denser forms, smaller lot fabrics in some of our newer developments, it's certainly an avenue that we are exploring with new plans of subdivisions in our urban areas, that there will be a covenant on title that strictly states that the garage is to be included as a parking space. So whoever's purchasing that property, it's registered on title and it is known that that is a parking space for the use of a vehicle.
Okay, thank you. The previous one was through you, Madam Mayor, so I apologize. Through you, Madam Mayor, again, to you, or perhaps to the rest of council, for the deferral, I'm not suggesting an indefinite timeline. I don't know what happens given that we're approaching an election and changeover council and lame duck period and all this other kind of these considerations. I'm not sure how we can stipulate exactly what the timeline would be, but I agree with Councillor O'Sullivan's comment about it not being unnecessarily long. I think everybody would like to have an answer to this, Mr. Lockwood as well as the rest of the folks who are here in the room. So I guess I'm seeking guidance as to what that would be. I don't know if there are any recommendations from the clerk or anybody else in the room. Thank you.
Ms. Martin, there is no stipulation, so I think it's at our discretion. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Worship.
Okay. So as a mover, Councillor Strachan, if you wish to move them or amend the motion to say a deferral of 3 months, I think that would provide some structure in terms of when something might come back. So it really is at your discretion and with the agreement of the seconder.
Yeah, to you, Madam Mayor, I think a deferral of 3 months would probably be reasonable given everything that's before us, and that would get us through also a potential lame duck period as well, I think. Okay. So that would be my amendment to the motion.
Councillor Wilson, are you amenable? Sorry? To the 3 months? Okay, stipulation? Okay. Okay, colleagues, we've been at this for almost 2 hours. We appreciate everyone coming to express concerns and perspectives. And at this point, I think I'm going to call a vote. All in favor, please. Okay, it is a deferral. Ms. Martin, perhaps we can follow up with you tomorrow and just get some more information about how we can support you in responding or working with the property owner should the application come back. Thanks. Okay, thank you everyone for being here. We appreciate your time. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll just take a minute or so. Okay, we're going to keep moving. Thank you very much. Next on our agenda is the signed bylaw amendment. And Ms. Martin, I think you're going to be ready to speak to that. It's amazing how dramatically this room changed after the conclusion of that one item.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think I was just making some more comments to Councillor Barkley. It's just, you know, the exciting part is still yet to come in the housing strategy, which actually speaks to a lot of some of the items that were discussed during that public meeting. But first, we'll deal with the matter of a rather quick and straightforward amendment to our sign bylaw. So if we go to the next slide, please. So a little bit of a background. The municipality has received feedback from various businesses in regards to our sign bylaws as it pertains to our temporary sign provisions in regards to charitable events where these signs are located on municipal property. So we do allow for charitable event signs to be placed on municipal property, for example, say within Rotary Park or at the municipal center, to advertise a charitable event. The restrictions currently within the bylaw would prevent any sign where there is an identifiable business or logo on there from being put on our property, which has raised a bit of a concern from some businesses, as oftentimes that's a way of identifying where the event is happening. Next slide, please. So what staff have done is we've reviewed the bylaw and we're proposing an amendment to essentially remove that restriction in regards to that there cannot be a business logo on the sign itself. We recognize the importance of these charitable events that are being hosted by our local businesses and certainly want to continue to support that. We are still leaving in certain time restrictions, so you can have the sign up 14 days ahead of the event, so it just prevents a sign from just staying in one location permanently, and we do allow for some time after the event for the sign to come down. And it was raised to us, and it was a very valid point, that certain charities are actually tied to certain businesses. So Canadian Tire Jumpstart, a program where, you know, their logo is used as part of that program. So certainly we don't want to see any restrictions in regard to that. So the amendment being brought forward is amending the provision within the sign bylaw in regards to charitable signs, as well as the definition of a charitable sign, just to ensure that we're not running into conflict with businesses who may incorporate their business information as a way of identifying the event. Next slide. And that concludes my rather brief presentation on this matter, and I will take any questions that council may have.
Well, certainly, I think I find that this makes sense. Increasingly, you know, charity events feature or leverage corporate engagement from the private sector, where there is an ethos of contributing back to the community. So in my opinion, I think the sign bylaw was rather limiting in not being able to name corporate sponsors or champions, and I think it's very practical in this day and age that we remove that limitation, and that just settles it once and for all. And if there are 5 business entities that want to put or highlight or celebrate a particular cause, so be it. So that's my opinion. Any other comments, council? Okay, with that in mind then, we will move. Sorry, I've lost it on the agenda. I've moved it so many times. Thank you, Ms. Workman. We will move, so I'll look for a mover and a seconder, that council approve and enact Bylaw 7722 to amend Bylaw 4716, being a bylaw to regulate and prohibit signs with respect to charitable and community services or events within North Grenville. I think we are moving to regulate more than prohibit. Okay, so we'll just say regulate, if you don't mind. And I'm looking for a mover and a seconder. Okay. I'll go Strack again. I don't know who I've chosen. Councillor Barkley, because it's your birthday. All right. If there's no further comments, no comments, I'll call the vote. All in favor? Good. Excellent. Thank you very much. So with that, I believe that we are now going to the housing strategy, right? Correct? Okay. And I do need to ask for 30 seconds just to grab some water. I took a quick break, but I didn't fully anticipate this section, so we're just taking 30 seconds. Are we still live in all of this banter? Okay. All right. So Ms. Martin, I know it's been a long couple of hours, so I appreciate your capacity to present a housing strategy, which interestingly dovetails in a very poignant way with what we've just discussed. So lots of room for reflection on what you're about to present to us, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Your Worship. So the housing strategy has been a long time coming in regards to being presented to council, and we've deferred it a few times to allow for meaningful discussion. And I think that highlighting the planning application that we considered tonight, I think it's kind of a bit of a dovetail into some of the items that we'll be discussing. So if we go to the next slide, please. So a little bit of background on the housing strategy. It certainly came on the heels of the affordable housing strategy that council adopted in January of 2021. And the intent of the housing strategy was to take a high-level lens look and consider the role of the municipality within the housing continuum. So that's housing, down from emergency shelters through transitional housing, through affordable housing, rental, and market-based ownership. So not just, in the past, we've really focused in on affordable housing, which is still a very important piece of our housing puzzle. But again, looking at, what is our role in housing in general? So we did contract SHS Consulting to assist in the creation of our housing strategy, and I'll just go to the next slide and I'll speak a bit about their methodology. So as part of the methodology, and as you will find within the strategy itself, they did undertake a literature review that included various policy documents, various rules of government. We did a housing needs assessment as well, so building off of what we had completed within the affordable housing strategy, just looking at what are our housing needs overall, not just on the affordable side. So when we're looking at setting targets for whether it's density or the new housing types that we should be encouraging, getting a better picture of like what are our real housing needs in North Grenville. And then there was also very extensive public consultation, and this did two things. So the first round of consultation focused on really setting the North Grenville context. It's really important to understand what the housing scene looks like in North Grenville. And then we took a second round of public consultation. It was a little more targeted towards people who were involved in housing creation and really worked on how do we prioritize some of these actions. Next slide, please. So the housing needs assessment, a few things that came out of the strategy, it identified a demand for purpose-built market rental units. I don't think anyone on council is unfamiliar to the need, the fact that we need more rental units. Certainly many individuals in the community do reach out to both staff and council, often looking for rental. It identified that seniors are the largest demographic in need of housing in North Grenville, and that smaller residential units are required. One of the statistics that I thought was worth pulling out, that 61.5% of our households in North Grenville are 1 to 2 people, yet 77.3% of all of our dwellings contain at least 3 bedrooms or more. So we have a lot of larger houses being occupied by smaller family units, but oftentimes what the barrier that we're seeing is that there's no smaller dwelling types for these individuals within the community to move into that would free up these larger homes for families or people who might need them. So it's creating a bit of a crunch in regards to being able to meet the demand for individuals who need the larger housing, but yet we don't have the supply on smaller units that these individuals need. As well, the housing needs assessment identified a need for more diverse forms of housing. So a large majority of our housing stock is single detached residential units. So there's more of an encouragement for medium density being semis, towns, up to even higher density is required within North Grenville. Next slide, please. In regards to public consultation, like I mentioned, the first round really focused on identifying the North Grenville context. It included members of the public, including past members from the Mayor's Task Force on Affordable Housing. And I just want to acknowledge, certainly their efforts throughout this process and their continued dedication towards really supporting that housing piece in North Grenville. Development communities, so we had people who are actively developing housing in North Grenville. We had not-for-profit agencies join us, including the counties, which was fantastic to have them at the table for the discussions, as well as municipal staff. And in the second round, as mentioned, we included individuals who are more geared towards the creation of housing. So we tried to ensure there was a good mix across all 4 of their sectors, but it was a little pared down compared to the first round of consultation. Next slide, please. So during the first round of public consultation, where we did actually have a session for members of the public to come out, there was an exercise that led to the creation of a vision statement for housing in North Grenville. And it stated that North Grenville is an inclusive and sustainable community where residents have access to a diverse range of housing options, including affordable and accessible housing in both the rural and urban areas. And I think it's really important that we highlight that this was developed from the comments of people in the community that came out and participated, who may have had a vested interest in housing or just really interested in how North Grenville's growing. So it's something that's truly developed from a vision from the community. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk council through, without going through into great detail, all of the recommendations. There were around 25 recommendations that are proposed by within the strategy to be implemented by the municipality. And before I get into each of the individual kind of hierarching ideas that are coming through as recommendations, I think what's really important to note is that in the next 1 to 2 years, we're going to be going through what I'm going to call the great refresh of our official plan. And a lot of the recommendations that are coming out of the affordable housing strategy and our housing strategy and other planning policy documents that we've been stacking up and setting up over the past few years is that these are going to be the bones that help guide staff when it comes to the policies that we need to put in place to support the growth and development within North Grenville. Now, certainly the official plan exercise will be much more comprehensive, and certainly this evening it really highlights the need to how do we bring, a balanced approach, a smart growth approach to North Grenville to ensure that we're respecting, what is North Grenville, the understanding of the community, but also being able to support that growth. And housing is certainly our largest sector in which we see that growth happening. So ensuring that we're taking that balanced approach, and the housing strategy is a big piece of that. So what I want to highlight is there's three main pillars under which recommendations were being made. And the first is policy and regulation. So the strategy recommends that we further define our housing targets to be incorporated into the official plan. And the strategy itself does provide very specific targets that the municipality should consider that go just above and beyond breaking down our mix of singles versus semis. And it further goes into talking about requiring that 20% of all new dwellings be rentals. Again, trying to fill that need that was identified within our housing need assessment. And again, really supporting, our goal of 25% of all new dwellings be provided as affordable, but then breaking that down based on unit type. And again, that's taking the projections as to where our population demand and the number of households that we're seeing, where that need's going to be. So further, trying to set more targets that we can then use to measure our development against to see are we actually reaching what the community needs are based on the information that we have. It also encourages us to review our North Grenville's current housing density provisions and identifying areas where higher density development can be supported. So really looking at where are those higher density growth areas, best located, and ensuring that we have the enabling policy to allow for that to happen. Develop a surplus property policy focused on the creation of affordable housing. So that would be an internal policy to the municipality when we have surplus lands and how we deal with them. And then creation and implementation of a rental retention policy. So that policy would protect against, so in most municipalities, it's where you have 4 or more dwelling units. If the building is demolished, it's ensuring that we're not losing those units, that we're retaining them and requiring that whatever is being put back there is replaced the same number of units or more, and then providing, that the people who rent those units have the ability to rent a new unit at a similar price to what they were renting previously. Next slide, please. So the program's process and funding is the second pillar under which recommendations are being made. This includes prioritizing development applications that are geared towards creating purpose-built, market-based, and affordable multi-residential units. So the intent there would be that when we receive a development application, that staff put priority on anything that's going to be creating those, it's market-based or affordable rental units. Find efficiencies within the development process, create a concierge one-window service for a residential planning application, establishment of an affordable housing fund, and I will note that Council did allocate funds this year for affordable housing within the 2022 budget, expanding the downtown community improvement plan to include affordable housing, and then as well as considering the development of a brownfields program to consider the conversion of underutilized lands for residential purposes. Next slide, please. And the last pillar under which recommendations are made are for partnerships, education, and advocacy, and that includes developing an annual housing report card, development of a rental housing database, creating supportive materials for additional residential units, facilitating partnerships for the creation of affordable housing units, working with our county partners and CMHC to host a biannual housing summit, coordinating with community agencies to host housing conversations, identify opportunities to increase the supply of subsidized housing, and advocating for increased funding from the provincial government. And that concludes my formal presentation. I know there's a lot packed into the strategy. I'm not certain if there's, very specific questions in regards to the document itself, but what I will say is that through that prioritization process, when you actually go through the document itself, you'll see, certain recommendations are identified as more of a priority over others, and it just flags that through that second round of consultation, that's what was seen by those involved as things that the municipality should focus on maybe more first, as a way of trying to move forward. How do we view housing? How do we support housing? And what should we be doing? Whether it's a policy perspective or on the advocacy side. So I will end my presentation and take any questions from council. I know this has been a long time coming, so I'm very excited that I'm able to present it this evening, and I'm really excited to see some of the positive outcomes that the strategy will have on our housing development.
Thanks very much. I have a question, but I think Councillor Barkley, you might too. Is that right? Did you raise your hand? Okay, so I'll defer to you. I'll put myself on the agenda, and then anyone else.
Okay, thank you, Madam Mayor. Is this because it's my birthday again?
Yes, 100%.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'll make good use of it. A few comments that I think will result in a question, a very specific question. But it's interesting that you note, Director Martin, that next year we'll be working, or the next council, will be working on an official plan. And I think tonight we saw what happens when market demand brings forward an intensification project before we have, approved a housing strategy, which would, as Councillor Wilson pointed out, she talked about that community as being identified as historic, and maybe that's where we don't want to intensify. So we don't have a housing strategy, yet we've got a development in front of us. It's a bit of a challenge. We don't have a parking study that would guide us in making a decision about, again, a market-driven project coming forward to us. We haven't got a handle on what we want to do with public transit. We know we need to develop public transit. The stormwater management master plan hasn't been completed, so we don't know which areas are going to be upgraded in terms of sewage and stormwater. So it's really difficult to handle these kind of projects that come our way. And it leads, reminds me of the comment that I made about we're playing catch up. It's the rate of growth, how fast we're growing, that is challenging to get a handle on. But it's very encouraging that we have a housing strategy and these other things that we have in play. So my question to Director Martin is, given today's zoning bylaw amendment where they're looking for R1 to R2, is there anything from the discussion earlier today that sort of stands out about what priorities we need to address in the housing strategy? You're very familiar with the housing strategy. I know it's been a long road to hoe, and I'm just wondering if anything stands out. Because it's kind of interesting that we've, this evening, in terms of how we grapple with these questions, that we are playing a certain amount of catch-up. So where, in all the priorities in the housing study, which one is most relevant to the zoning bylaw amendment we had today?
Thank you, Councillor Barkley. Through your worship to Councillor Barkley, I think the biggest piece that we need to focus on is density and identifying those areas that are appropriate for intensification, and it's not just, what does intensification look like overall, but what does intensification look like for our, pre-existing neighborhoods? What does intensification look like for more of our greenfield areas? What does intensification look like adjacent to our, major thoroughfares, adjacent to 43? And I'm going to pull in some items that came out of the affordable housing strategy that, are still not lost in staff, and items that we're still actively working on and will be incorporated as part of that official plan update. But, taking advantage of our highway commercial lands and requiring that we have mixed-use development where you have residential on top, where you can support higher stories, because there might be fewer land use conflicts surrounding you than compared to in pre-existing neighborhoods. I think there's, again, bringing some of the affordable housing strategy, a need for more community conversation, and certainly the housing strategy highlighted that, as well as how do we have those conversations with the community, and certainly in discussions with our deputy director as to how do we start outreaching now that we have more capacity within the department from a staffing perspective, to have these conversations with the community to understand, what is your understanding of planning and zoning and housing, and to really try and understand how are these issues, and provide some educational tools as well as to how can we work together, because certainly where there are opportunities to intensify, not everybody, I understand a lot of the comments that were provided tonight, but not everybody does want a large backyard. People, as certain individuals do grow older, they want less to take care of them from a maintenance perspective, or the people trying to to enter that market at that first time may want an additional residential unit in their basement because it's going to offset the cost of the mortgage just given the price of housing. And certainly, I mean, bringing in just, my personal experience, hearing a lot of the comments tonight, and, you often think as to what is the future generation and what are their housing needs. So, I think there's a lot of pieces on density. There's a lot of community conversation that I think still needs to happen. I think the official plan process will be a huge conduit for that to happen, certainly building on the principles that are presented here today.
So just following on that, just given the comments around, Councillor Wilson noting it's a bit of a heritage street, right? The way the housing strategy is written now, does it contemplate character sort of beyond, some of the ways in which a particular development is sort of seen to be complementary or aesthetically in line to the extent possible with what's been there in the past? Because clearly, I think what we heard tonight was there was a real attachment to a kind of lot, a kind of home, right? Older versus newer. A kind of experience on that street. And I just wonder if other municipalities kind of earmark certain areas as being more likely to have residential intensification be well received. And I'm not sure ultimately what I would want to see, but I'm just curious to know what your experience might be, Ms. Martin, with that compatibility, element, if you will, when we talk very specifically about residential intensification.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. So I think there's a few things that I'll point out is that typically those policies in regards to neighborhood compatibility are found within your official plan, and certainly they are found within ours, and that would be a commonality across many municipalities in Ontario. I'll also note that there are other mechanisms that can be contemplated to help set, neighborhood character and feel. One could be a secondary plan, which is, we've had discussions in regards to secondary plans for the downtown, or there, as far as something like a heritage conservation district, which certainly we've had communications within the community and other areas about how that's implemented. In regards to the application earlier this evening, as far as I'm aware, there is no heritage designation or district within the area that would say this is how it has to be built, and houses within this area have to be built to the standard or these design guidelines. There's nothing as that restrictive, so we then fall back to our official plan policies, which then speak to neighborhood character. And how does this fit in with the existing neighborhood when it comes to, and the official plan is quite detailed, and certainly staff will bring back a report that walks through each of the individual characteristics that have to be considered. So we do provide that, within an existing policy document. Certainly, again, as we move forward with, renewing our official plan or refreshing, whichever way you want to look at it, more care and consideration as we start to see more and more infill and intensification within pre-existing neighborhoods.
Okay, Councillor Sullivan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think, as I mentioned before, that as we do more infill and intensification, we need to ensure that we have some green space, park space, maybe a tot lot, and I don't know how we can fit that in, but I think that's a consideration that has to go into this housing strategy, because without places, if you intensify and you get a whole lot of kids on an older, small street, you need a place for them. And the other thing is, with respect to the parking, I think if we have a current parking requirement for how many parking spaces we need to have per residence, then we need to either make sure that that's consistent across the board, and that should probably be included in this housing strategy too, because otherwise this is always going to come up over and over again. So if that can be included, I think it would be good. And I don't know what we can do about ensuring some kind of park space for these areas, because otherwise there isn't anything. Every new development that we get, we're striving to have a park in it. So,
yes, Ms. Martin, go ahead.
If I may address your comment, Councillor Sullivan. So our design guidelines went to that full length in regards to new development as to what's required. So there's two types of development. So if we have a very site-specific, someone's building a multi-residential unit, and there's no mechanism for like a plan of subdivision or a severance, I don't have the ability to ask for parkland. However, we do have amenity space standards within our zoning bylaw that we do require the developer to meet, and if they can't meet them, then that becomes an exemption within a very site-specific zoning, and they would address it. This is why we're asking for no amenity space, because there might be a park right next door already. In regards to our newer developments where we might run into a plan of subdivision, that's where we do have the ability in the design guidelines establish that vision where consideration should be given for a park, depending on the size and the scale would depend on the size and scale of the park. The Parks and Rec Master Plan certainly speaks to that as well, and that would certainly be a consideration of those newer, larger developments coming through. A little more difficult to address on the smaller individual case-by-case intensifications where it's just a lot. But like I said, we do have amenity space provisions for those multi-residential units. And it typically, I think I'd have to review the bylaw, but it's in the R4 zone standard as to when that would apply. So it wouldn't apply necessarily for a semi-detached dwelling, but when you start to get 4 or more units as like a multi-residential apartment block, that's when they have to have amenity standards.
Thank you. And what is the current parking requirement? Is it 1 space per residence? Is that what our bylaw requires now?
That is correct until you get into the multi-residential. So I'm talking like the residential 4th density. So we're talking like apartment buildings. Then it's a 1.25 standard. So then the 0.25 starts to help inform the visitor parking.
I just have a question about the data. So I'm curious, in some parts of this report, it refers to census data from 2021, and then in other parts it's citing 2016 data. And I don't know why we wouldn't have used the updated census data unless only part of the StatsCan information was out at the completion of this report. But that being said, what I see here is family households with children represent 39.8% of all households in North Grenville. And this household type was the fastest growing from 2006 to 2016, experiencing nearly 44% growth in this period. Just given what we saw in terms of shifting or a surge of interest in North Grenville, I've always thought that maybe that household type, in fact, even further increased because of the want for many to get outside of the city. And I just don't know anecdotally, or if I can make a formal request to get this information updated with the 2021 census data.
So thank you, Your Worship. So staff can endeavor with the census information still rolling out over the course of this year to update it. The housing needs assessment occurred late in 2021, so we did I think it was like late February that the earliest census data came out and the project was wrapping up. So it's one of the limitations with our census cycles and how the data is released, but certainly these are statistics that staff will be looking at and considering as part of our update to the official plan as well.
Yes, I think that would be helpful because as we contemplate housing types, I think what we heard again tonight is that there are, families seeking, right, a particular kind of housing experience, whereas we know we have a lot of seniors, so that was also clearly identified in the report, that may be looking for a different housing experience. So what's that balance look like, if you will?
So, from the perspective of the data that was presented within the report, we certainly have a lot of individuals. I can't say a lot, it's hard to put a metric to a lot, but 77% of our households are 3 bedrooms or more, and 61.5% of our population, based on the census data up until 2016, are 2 people or less household sizes. We have a lot of larger homes and home stock, and we don't have as much of that rental or those smaller units for individuals who are ready to downsize to free up that housing stock. So certainly, on the building side, from like a new housing start, last year we had just over 200 new residential units that were created. Quite a few of those, a majority of those were single detached dwellings. But in order to free up that space, you need a place for someone to go. And certainly in some of the conversations I've been having with members of the community and developers and even with staff is that, I understand that the fear of the unknown and, people see density is maybe not keeping within character of the town, but that allows for more units to become available for people within our town to stay within our town and not have to relocate somewhere where they can get a smaller unit. And these are people within our community that are actively looking for this form of housing type that's just not available to them. So they are staying in their houses longer, and that until such a time that they're just not physically capable of, whether it's keeping up with such a large house or a yard, or other factors force them to move out. And certainly one of the great things about encouraging additional residential units is that it could allow for someone's family to move in with them, and maybe that older parents move into a smaller unit and still have that connection and support within the community. So it's kind of a bit of a multiple issues that are compounding with each other, which is certainly why the recommendations within the strategy provide some more specific targets when it comes to the creation of a variety of different housing types beyond single detached dwellings. Long answer, but I just think it's a very complex issue as how do we address this. We do have a growing family population, but we also still have a growing smaller household population as well.
And there is no doubt that many seniors in this community have reinforced what are extremely limited options. And what I always find interesting about new builds, whether they're rental, whether they're smaller homes, is they absolutely provide choice in the community. Forget people moving to North Grenville. Within North Grenville, you find that people, in fact, embrace some of the options that come on the table that haven't been as available in the past if you're looking at multi-residential units or smaller homes. So I hear you. That resonates for sure. And to your point, it's a balance. I have one last question. I don't mean to dominate, so I'll go to Councillor Strachan next. Just 20% of all new housing units built each year should be purpose-built rental housing units. In your mind, how realistic is that target?
I'll speak anecdotally based on just conversations or I guess trends that we're seeing on the pre-consultation side is that it is realistic. I think people are starting to see the people, being developers, are seeing the demand for that type of housing. And certainly there's, appetite within the development community to shift towards that style of housing. Now, you'll always have your traditional developers that build your single detached, subdivisions, but there has been a very strong shift towards medium to higher density developments with a focus on rentals.
Okay, Councillor Strachan.
Through you, Madam Mayor, thank you very much, Director Martin. I think that there's a lot of great information in here. I think it's very comprehensive, so I appreciate the time and effort that went into bringing all this information together, the census data and the stakeholder consultations and so on. So I think my takeaway from this is greater variety in the types of housing, the size of housing, the price range effectively of the type of housing that's available, rental stock and so on. And I think that I think there's a lot of pieces in here that I was reading along going, yep, heard that. So it's good to see it reflected in the data as well. So kudos to everybody involved in bringing that part together. I still don't like the parking section because it still says 1. Yes, 1.25, but that's because you get one guest per 4 units or something like that. So, I think that, the conversation tonight wasn't only about the look of the dwelling, right? I mean, there were certainly concerns about that, but it's, taking away space, having less green space, having, it's everything's about less, right? And it shouldn't be that way if there's an understanding going into this ahead of time. So if there are areas that are, identified as, these are intensification neighborhoods, then we're sort of already halfway into the conversation, right? And that people are coming in with that expectation, residents will understand, then we're not stuck having to justify, why that neighborhood and that kind of conversation. So I think it's good to inform, but we would have something to, show to say this is why these areas have been chosen. And, further to that, I think that there's lots of great conversations that can be had about what it means to have these different styles of housing in there and what that actually offers for the character of the community. So maybe a bit beyond the housing strategy, but the way I like to look at it is the sort of that diversity of families, people who are living there. It's not a seniors community, and it's not just a family community. That there's a lot to be said for communities that have that different makeup to it as well, and that's the housing as well as the people who live there. So I like that. There's lots of good things in here about seniors, accessible housing, supportive housing, more environmentally friendly, efficient housing builds, and so on. So I guess I'm going to have to look at it more closely and reread it again because there's a lot in there. But overall, I think this is a huge step forward. So thank you very much for getting this to us. Finally, I know we delayed it a little bit, so thank you.
Okay, any further comments? I know it's late. We have other staff waiting eagerly to give reports. Amy, you've been the star of the show, along with Mr. Mosher, of course, for the last few minutes. Hours. No, minutes, hours. Okay, so, council colleagues, if there's nothing else, I'll look for a mover and a seconder that council receive and adopt the housing strategy. Council Barkley, Council Strachan, there you go. Any final thoughts? Seeing none, I will call the question. All in favor? Good. Thank you, Ms. Martin. I appreciate, and I think the words you used to describe doing a wholesome, comprehensive update. What did you call it? What was the R?
I'm affectionately calling it the Great Refresh.
The Great Refresh. The Great Refresh or the Great Reset? That's really my question.
Yes, it's very subjective terms, but certainly, from my perspective, professional opinion is that we need to really relook at our official plan across all spectrums and create a very unique document that sets our planning vision, but also tries to resolve a lot of the concerns that we're hearing in regards to how do you support development, but at the same time still support what is the identity of North Grenville, and what's that planning vision for that development, and how do we support those smart growth and balanced principles. And certainly in my 3.5 years here at the municipality, it's not an easy question to resolve. So certainly we'll be looking towards that process with a very fulsome public consultation piece on it to really hear from the community as to how do we approach that yet still support that growth piece to keep people within North Grenville as they age through life. So there is lots to come on that. Really excited for it. So we can review it as maybe a reset, a refresh, but it'll be, I'm excited. I'm a planner. It's my job to be, excited about these things. But I really hope that the same level of enthusiasm carries through with the public.
So we'll say the Great Refresh. Okay. Okay, well, thank you. I think you've summed it up nicely. We appreciate your vigilance and ongoing commitment and look forward to more discussion. Thanks. If nothing else, we have something very fulsome to hand off to the next council, whoever they may be. So, all right. So I think at this point, we're going into a closed session, council colleagues. And with that in mind, if I'm correct, who do we need in the room for the closed session, Ms. Workman? Okay, Kena, Director Dunlop, so our planning staff are free to go, is that the case? Okay.